The silence around Apries in popular historical consciousness is proportionate to none of the significance his reign carries. He is the pharaoh between Necho and Amasis, the man between two more celebrated figures, and that positioning has consistently rendered him invisible in the popular narrative of the Site dynasty. But the visibility of the pharaohs on either side of him is not diminished by attending to the pharaoh between them. Understanding Apries in his full complexity does not reduce the achievements of Psamtik II or Necho or Amasis. It adds to the picture of the dynasty's full arc, a picture that includes necessarily the specific crisis and the specific structural exposure that defined the middle of the dynasty's history. Without the full picture, the Site dynasty appears to be a story of sustained and nearly unbroken success. Psamtik's founding, Necho's ambition, the brief Cyrene setback, Amasis's glory. With the full picture, the dynasty appears as something more complex and more instructive. A story of genuine achievement maintained across multiple generations by continuous institutional management, disrupted at a specific moment by the specific failure of that management, and rebuilt in the aftermath by a successor who understood what the failure had revealed. The full picture is more interesting than the simplified one. The full picture is also more historically accurate, and the full picture requires Apries in his full complexity, not as the transitional pharaoh who preceded the great Amasis, but as the specific ruler whose specific failure shaped the specific character of Amasis's success. That shaping relationship is Apries' lasting historical significance. The pharaoh who lost to the Greeks made possible the conditions under which the pharaoh who never lost could govern with the specific corrective intelligence that the dynasty needed at its most critical institutional moment. This is the final element of the deeper truth, and with it, the deeper truth is now complete. The implications and the closing follow. Step back from the specific story of Apries and look at the broader pattern. This series has traced the story of Egyptian civilization across an extraordinary arc. From Psamtik I's patient restoration of sovereignty in the 7th century BC, through the outward ambitions of Necho II and the commercial brilliances of Amasis, through the sustained building of Nectanebo II and the founding vision of Ptolemy I, through the civilizational peak of Ptolemy II and the crisis that produced the Rosetta Stone under Ptolemy V. Now it has returned, in this account, to a figure who sits in the middle of the Site period's arc, the pharaoh between the dynasty's most ambitious projector of power and its most successfully managed commercial period. Apries is not the most important figure in the arc, but his specific place in the arc, the point of failure between two successes, makes him one of the most instructive. He is the figure who shows where the edges are. He is the ruler under whom the accumulated institutional tensions of the Site formula became visible in their most politically explosive form. He is the specific example that reveals what the dynasty's characteristic strength required to sustain itself, and what happened when the sustaining fell short of what was required. The implication that this specific example most urgently presses on the present is about the relationship between institutional inheritance and institutional maintenance. Every powerful institution is, in some fundamental sense, an inherited structure, something that the current generation of practitioners has received from previous generations, has been trained to operate, and is responsible for maintaining and transmitting to the following generation. The specific challenge of maintaining an inherited institution is different from the challenge of founding one, and it is different from the challenge of rebuilding one after a failure. Psamtik was the founder, Amasis was the rebuilder, Apries was the maintainer who failed, and the specific character of his failure, the way in which the specific tensions of the inherited structure accumulated beneath the surface of apparent stability until a specific external shock triggered their explosive release, is a pattern that applies far beyond the specific context of the 6th century BC Sati dynasty. Hybrid institutions that depend on the management of multiple genuinely different populations or constituencies with different relationships to the central authority, are always under this specific kind of stress. The stress is not a bug, it is a feature. the specific dynamism and the specific productivity of hybrid institutions comes precisely from the encounter of different traditions and different capabilities within a single institutional framework. The Library of Alexandria, the commercial synthesis of the Sate period, the specific productive tensions of the Greek-Egyptian encounter that made Ptolemaic civilization extraordinary. All of these were the products of the hybrid character of the institutions that produced them. But the productive tension and the destructive tension are not the same thing. The productive tension generates creativity, dynamism, commercial effectiveness, intellectual vitality. The destructive tension generates the specific kind of institutional grievance that, under the right triggering conditions, can overwhelm the productive aspects of the hybrid and produce the catastrophic breakdown that Apries experienced. Managing the difference, keeping the productive tension alive while preventing the accumulation of the destructive tension to the explosive point, is the specific institutional challenge that the Sate dynasty's formula always presented. Psamtik managed it through the specific wisdom of the founder, who understood every joint in the structure. Amasis managed it through the specific corrective intelligence of the rebuilder who had seen the structure's failure and understood its causes. Apries managed it for 15 years through the competent maintenance of a man who had inherited the structure without having designed it and without yet having seen it fail. The implication for any organization that depends on the management of hybrid institutional tensions is specific and practical. The maintenance of that management is not a routine background activity that can be subordinated to the external activities of the organization. It is a central organizational priority requiring active and sustained attention because the specific kind of institutional failure that insufficient maintenance produces tends to be invisible until it is catastrophic. Apries did not see the crisis coming. The stability was real. The tensions were invisible against the background of the stability. And the Cyrene disaster revealed, in a single external shock, the full extent of what had been accumulating beneath the visible surface. The second implication concerns the relationship between external ambition and internal institutional health. Apries was an outward-looking ruler, a pharaoh who invested his attention and his resources in the external world of Levantine politics and Mediterranean commercial strategy, rather than in the internal institutional foundations of his dynasty's legitimacy. The external world deserved the attention. The Babylonian advance, the Cyrene situation, the broader transformation of the Mediterranean strategic environment all required genuine engagement. But the internal world also deserved attention. The specific institutional maintenance that the temple construction program represented, the maintenance of the priestly establishment's relationship to the royal authority, the continuous demonstration of the pharaoh's commitment to the ancient religious obligations that were the foundation of native Egyptian legitimacy, was not optional. It was the institutional work that sustained the pharaoh's authority with the native Egyptian population in ways that no amount of military or diplomatic success in the external world could substitute for. Apries underinvested in this internal institutional work, not catastrophically. The temples did not collapse, the priestly establishment did not rebel, but he invested at a level that was adequate for stability and inadequate for crisis. And when the external crisis of Cyrene arrived and produced the internal institutional crisis of the army revolt, the underinvestment was revealed as a structural vulnerability. The lesson is not that outward-looking rulers are bad rulers. The lesson is that outward-looking energy requires an equivalent inward-looking discipline, a sustained attention to the internal institutional health that sustains the authority on which the external ambitions depend. Without that internal sustaining, the external ambitions are built on a foundation that can give way under specific conditions. Apries' foundation gave way under the specific conditions of the Cyrene disaster. The lesson is about the foundation, the lesson is about the sustaining, and the lesson, learned properly from the specific case of Apries, is the explanation of why Amasis' significantly more ambitious commercial and diplomatic engagement with the external world was nevertheless more stable than Apries'. Because Amasis had learned from Apries' failure that the internal institutional sustaining was not a secondary concern, but a necessary condition for the external ambitions to be viable. Our place on this planet, managing the institutional inheritances that previous generations have built, maintaining the specific balances that allow those inheritances to continue functioning, attending to the specific internal tensions that the most productive institutional arrangements always carry, is not entirely different from the place that Apries occupied. We are also maintainers, at least in part. We have also inherited structures that we did not design. We are also responsible for sustaining them in conditions where the specific accumulated stresses are not always visible from the surface of apparent stability. The story of Apries, the specific way in which the accumulated tensions of a hybrid institutional arrangement became visible and explosive under the specific conditions of a single external shock, is a story worth holding in mind as we manage the institutional inheritances that are our own responsibility. The institutional tensions are always accumulating. The external shocks are always potentially available to trigger them. The question is whether the specific level of active institutional attention that the tensions require is being provided. Apries provided it at an adequate level for stability and an inadequate level for crisis. The lesson is the gap between those two levels. The Pharaoh who lost to the Greeks lost because the gap was too large, and the lesson of the gap, the specific, practically applicable lesson about the relationship between institutional maintenance and institutional resilience, is the most important legacy his reign leaves to anyone willing to look at it. Honestly, the looking has now been done, the lesson has been named, the reflection closes here, and the account moves to its conclusion. There is one final observation that belongs to this reflection, and it concerns the place of this account within the series that has produced it. This series began with Psamtik I, the founder who built the hybrid, and has now returned to the middle of the Sate period to examine the ruler who revealed the hybrid's structural limits. It has also moved forward through the Ptolemaic period to examine the ways in which the hybrid formula was maintained, extended, and eventually transformed in the conditions of the Hellenistic world. The arc is not simply a story of success followed by failure, followed by foreign domination. It is a story of a specific institutional tradition, 3,000 years deep, navigating a series of specific historical crises with the specific tools that the tradition had developed, finding new forms of expression in the specific conditions of each new era, and ultimately transmitting the most essential elements of its accumulated wisdom into the hands of the scholars and the priests and the administrative officials who carried them forward through the Ptolemaic period and beyond. Apries is a specific moment in this arc, the moment of a specific institutional failure that did not end the institution. The institution survived, it adapted, it rebuilt, and the specific lesson that Apries' failure contributed to the institution's rebuilding, the lesson that Amasis learned and applied across 44 years of corrective governance, was itself a form of the institutional wisdom's development. The institution learns from its failures. The best institutions are those that can be damaged by specific failures without being destroyed by them, and that can incorporate the specific lessons of those failures into the subsequent functioning of the institution in ways that make the same failure less likely to recur. The Sate dynasty did this. Amasis incorporated the specific lessons of Apries' failure into a governance that was better, in the specific respects that Apries had been worse. For the full 44 years of his reign, the institution was not destroyed by the failure, it was educated by it. This is the final implication of the story of Apries. Not simply that institutional failures are instructive. This is obvious and requires no specific historical example to establish, but that the specific character of institutional failures, the particular pattern of overextension and undermaintenance and accumulated institutional tension that characterizes the specific case of Apries, is the kind of failure that the most resilient institutions are designed to survive and learn from. The Sate dynasty was, for most of its existence, that kind of institution. The story of Apries is the story of its most serious test. The story of Amasis is the story of its recovery, and together They are the story of an institutional tradition that proved more durable than any single ruler it produced. The pharaoh who lost to the Greeks was the test. The institution passed it. The closing follows. The specific character of that test, the Cyrene disaster, the army revolt, the Battle of Memphis, the death of Apries, was examined in the fullest available detail in the preceding sections. The implications of that test, for the understanding of hybrid institutional arrangements, and for the broader question of how institutions sustain themselves across specific failures, have now been drawn out in the reflection this section provides. What remains is the closing, the final accounting, the direct answer to the title question, the last image that this account leaves the listener with. The closing follows, and with it, the account of the pharaoh who lost to the Greeks reaches its end. The pharaoh who lost to the Greeks was not in the end lost. He is here in this account, examined and understood, and given the full historical recognition that the silence around him had too long withheld. The account was worth writing. The recognition is worth giving. And the lesson, specific, practically applicable, drawn from the specific conditions of a specific historical failure, is the most valuable legacy of a reign that ended badly. Bad endings can teach well. This one has. He was buried at Sais. Amasis, the man who had overthrown him, had him interred in the royal tombs of the Sidon dynasty with the full ceremony appropriate to the pharaonic tradition. The ceremony that connected the dead king to the 3,000-year succession of pharaohs who had been buried in the Nile Valley with the ritual preparations that the Egyptian tradition had always maintained. It was, by ancient standards, a generous act. Amasis did not need to bury Apries with honour. He could have left him in whatever circumstances the battle had produced. The specific decision to give him the royal burial, to treat the man he had overthrown as a legitimate pharaoh, deserving of the institutional recognition that the pharaonic tradition accorded to its dead kings, was the specific act of a ruler who understood the symbolic continuity of the institution he had inherited through a violent transition. It was also the act of a man who had, it seems, a genuine human acknowledgement of the specific tragedy of the life that had just ended. Apries had been pharaoh for 19 years. He had attempted things that his predecessors had not attempted. He had managed, for most of those 19 years, a genuinely difficult strategic environment with genuine competence. He had looked outward at the changing world of the 6th century BC Mediterranean and tried to keep Egypt relevant in that changing world through engagement, through intervention, through the active projection of the Sidon formula's specific combination of military and diplomatic capacity. He had failed, not because he was simply inadequate, because the specific combination of structural vulnerabilities and external conditions and the specific moment of the Cyrene disaster had assembled into a configuration that his specific level of institutional management could not contain. Amasis buried him with honour. History has, largely, buried him in obscurity. This account has attempted to do something different, to give the pharaoh who lost to the Greeks the full accounting that the evidence supports and that the obscurity has withheld. The answer to the title question, who was Apries, the pharaoh who lost to the Greeks, is now as complete as this account can make it. He was the 4th king of the 26th dynasty, son of Psamtik II, grandson of Necho II. He came to the throne in approximately 589 BC and ruled Egypt for 19 years until his overthrow in approximately 570 BC. He was a pharaoh of genuine ambition and genuine competence who attempted to maintain Egyptian influence across the eastern Mediterranean world, in Judea, in Phoenicia, in Cyrenaica, in the specific conditions of the early 6th century BC Mediterranean, when the Babylonian Empire was restructuring the Near East and the Greek colonial world was demonstrating military capabilities that the Sidon strategic calculus had not fully anticipated. He relied on Greek mercenaries as the professional core of his military force, maintained them as a personal bodyguard, and managed the relationship between the Greek professional component and the native Egyptian component of his military with less active attention than the accumulated institutional tensions of the hybrid Sate formula required. He sent the native Egyptian force to Cyrene in a campaign that ended in a military defeat that triggered the long-accumulated institutional grievances of the native military against the dynasty's Greek-first institutional priorities. He sent Amasis to manage the resulting revolt, and Amasis instead led it. He fought Amasis at Memphis in the Delta and lost. He died shortly afterward, in circumstances the ancient sources do not fully agree on. He was buried at Sais, in the royal tombs of the dynasty he had governed, by the man who had overthrown him. The temples he did not build enough of still stand in the Nile Valley, maintained by the successors and the successors' successors who used his reign as the specific lesson about what not to do. The palace he built at Memphis has been partially recovered by modern archaeology. The inscriptions he left at Karnak and other sites are readable. The cartouche of Wahibri, his Egyptian royal name, appears in the standard pharaonic forms that the site tradition maintained with such meticulous consistency. He is there, in the stone, in his full royal titulary. The specific tragedy of a specific moment, the army in Cyrene, the messenger to Amasis, the horse being mounted, a crown being accepted, is recorded in Herodotus with the vividness of a story that was still being told, a century and a half after the events, with the specific clarity of a moment that had changed everything. The soldier sent to stop a revolt, who became the revolt. The pharaoh who trusted the man he sent to stop the revolt. The army that chose the man over the pharaoh, and chose correctly in the specific sense that the man would govern better than the pharaoh had, and chose at a specific cost to the pharaoh that was as complete as costs can be. The story has the quality of inevitability in retrospect. The structural tensions were real. The specific conditions for their expression were assembling. The Cyrene disaster was the trigger. The revolt was the explosion. The battle was the resolution. And the outcome, in retrospect, looks like the only outcome that the specific configuration of forces could have produced. But it was not inevitable in prospect. The specific configuration of forces assembled under Apries' specific reign, in the specific conditions of the early 6th century BC Mediterranean, different choices at specific moments could have produced different configurations. The trigger might not have been pulled at Cyrene. The revolt might not have been triggered by the defeat. The course of history, even in the small arena of a single dynasty's succession, is not written in advance. Apries encountered a specific historical moment with a specific level of institutional management. The moment required more than he provided. The gap between what the moment required and what he provided was the gap that the Cyrene disaster exposed. That gap is the story of the pharaoh who lost to the Greeks. It is a story about the specific kinds of institutional failure that the most capable rulers produce when the structural tensions of inherited arrangements exceed the specific level of active maintenance provided. It is a story about the specific gap between external ambition and internal institutional health. It is a story about the specific moment when an accumulated institutional tension finds its specific trigger and releases. It is also a story about the specific act of a successor who buried his predecessor with honor and then spent 44 years doing the work that the predecessor had not adequately done. The act of burial was the acknowledgement. The 44 years were the learning. The pharaoh who lost to the Greeks did not lose everything. He taught the pharaoh who followed him what winning actually required. Look at the ground beneath your feet differently. The Sidon dynasty governed Egypt from a city, Sais, that now lies buried beneath a modern Egyptian town, inaccessible to systematic excavation, holding whatever physical remains the accidents of 2,500 years have preserved from the specific civilization that Apries and his predecessors and his successor built. The royal tombs where Apries was buried are there, somewhere, beneath the modern town. The palace at Memphis that he built has left its traces in the ground that Petrie excavated. The cartouche of Wahibri appears on the standing monuments of the Nile Valley at the sites where he left his mark. He was there. He built things. He attempted things. He failed at the thing that mattered most, at the specific moment that mattered most. And, in failing, he taught the dynasty what it needed to know to survive for another generation. His name was Apries, the pharaoh who lost to the Greeks. And now the full account of what that loss meant has been given. Think about what it means to lose to the world you trusted. To be defeated not by a stranger but by the specific kind of force you had always cultivated, relied on, organized your military around. The Greek colonial soldiers who defeated his army at Cyrene were the same kind of soldiers as the Greek mercenaries, who were his most trusted professional military resource. The world he had trusted turned against him, not in the Greek mercenaries of his own army, who remained loyal to the end, but in the specific demonstration that the Greek world beyond his army was militarily capable of defeating the native Egyptian forces he had sent against it. The defeat was a mirror. The mirror showed the institutional asymmetry that the Site formula had always carried, and the native soldiers, who had been living with that asymmetry for their entire careers, saw in the mirror what they had always feared: that the asymmetry was real, that the Pharaoh valued the Greek world over the Egyptian world, that their lives had been spent in the service of a formula that did not, in the end, treat them as equal to the Greek soldiers their Pharaoh preferred. Whether the interpretation was accurate is less important than the fact that it was compelling. The revolt happened. The Pharaoh fell, the dynasty survived. His name was Apries, the Pharaoh who lost to the Greeks. And now the full account of what that loss meant has been given. Now you know it. He sent his army to fight the Greeks, and his army came home in pieces. Not metaphorically. The Egyptian force dispatched by the Pharaoh Apries to support the Libyan city of Cyrene against its Greek colonial neighbours returned to Egypt defeated, humiliated, and furious. Furious, not in the vague, general way that armies returning from catastrophic defeats are furious, but furious in a very specific and politically explosive way. They had been sent, many of them believed, because their own Pharaoh wanted them destroyed. Because Apries had calculated, or so the returning soldiers were convinced, that a native Egyptian army, weakened and reduced by a foreign campaign, would be less capable of challenging the power of the Greek mercenary units that formed the professional core of his military, because the Pharaoh had used his own soldiers as tools of his own security against his own people. Whether this charge was true is impossible to determine from 25 centuries of distance. What is certain is that the soldiers believed it, and the believing changed everything. Apries sent a man named Amasis, a senior military commander, known and trusted by the troops, to calm the discontent before it became rebellion. Amasis arrived in the camp, assessed the situation with the particular clarity of a man who had been a soldier long enough to know what soldiers look like when they are about to cross a line, and made a calculation. He mounted his horse. He let the soldiers crown him. He rode back to the capital at the head of an army, and he replaced the Pharaoh who had sent him to prevent exactly this. The overthrow of Apries by Amasis in approximately 570 BC is one of the most consequential political events in the entire history of the Site dynasty. It ended the reign of one of the most ambitious, most diplomatically active, and most militarily aggressive pharaohs of the late period. It ended a period of Egyptian engagement with the wider Mediterranean world that had been characterized by extraordinary reach and equally extraordinary risk, and it produced the 44-year reign of Amasis, already described in an earlier chapter of this series, which was in many ways the direct reaction to everything that Apries had attempted and failed. By the end of tonight, you are going to understand not just who Apries was and why he lost, but what his specific failure reveals about the structural limits of the Site period's most characteristic ambition, the ambition of a restored native Egyptian dynasty to project power into a Mediterranean world that was becoming, with every decade, more dominated by forces that Egypt could influence but could not control. Let that sink in. A pharaoh who attempted to intervene in Libya, Lebanon, and possibly Judea simultaneously, who built one of the most cosmopolitan courts in the ancient world, who maintained what ancient sources describe as a personal bodyguard of Greek and Carian soldiers, who ruled a kingdom at the height of its commercial and diplomatic sophistication, brought low by a single military defeat and the rage of the soldiers who had survived it. The fall was swift. The conditions for the fall had been building for years. The story of how those conditions built is the story of Apries. Before we get started, if you find these stories as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It is a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. Now let's begin. The story of Apries is the story of overreach, not the shallow kind of overreach, not the simple vanity of a ruler who imagined himself greater than he was. The deeper kind, the overreach of a genuinely capable ruler who inherited a genuinely powerful position, who was operating at the edge of what the Sate period's specific combination of resources and ambitions could support, and who pushed slightly too far at the specific moment when the external environment had shifted in ways that the previous generation's calculations did not account for. He is one of the more fascinating figures of the Site dynasty, and one of the least known outside specialist circles. His predecessor Necho II is remembered for the circumnavigation of Africa and the Battle of Megiddo. His successor Amasis is remembered for 44 years of extraordinary commercial and diplomatic brilliance. Apries, sandwiched between them, ruling for approximately 19 years between 589 and 570 BC, tends to appear in popular accounts as a transitional figure. The man who preceded Amasis, the Pharaoh, the Hebrew prophet Jeremiah, addressed in his oracles against Egypt. He deserves more than this. His reign was, in its own terms, one of the most energetically ambitious of the late period, and the specific way it ended, the military catastrophe, the soldiers' revolt, the overthrow by his own army, illuminates something essential about the structural tensions of the Site period that none of the other accounts in this series quite captures in the same way. The ambition was real, the failure was specific, and both deserve their full accounting. The story of the pharaoh who lost to the Greeks begins not with the defeat, but with the world that made the defeat possible. The world that made the defeat possible was the world of the early 6th century BC Mediterranean, a world transforming faster than any single ancient state could fully track, full of new forces and new pressures that the inherited strategic frameworks of the Site dynasty had not been designed to manage. Understanding that world is the first step toward understanding Apries, and that understanding begins now. To understand Apries, you need to understand what he inherited, and what he inherited was one of the most favorable strategic positions in the history of the Site dynasty, built by his grandfather Psamtik I and his father Necho II, and significantly extended by his predecessor Psamtik II. The Site dynasty, as described in earlier chapters of this series, had been built on a specific strategic foundation. The restoration of Egyptian sovereignty after a century of Assyrian dominance, achieved through patient alliance building, careful management of the transition between Assyrian and post-Assyrian power dynamics, and the deliberate cultivation of Greek military expertise through the settlement of mercenary communities in the Delta and the formal structuring of the Greek commercial presence at Naucratis. Psamtik I had done the founding work. Necho II had pushed the restoration outward, attempting to extend Egyptian influence into the Levant and launching the extraordinary Red Sea circumnavigation discussed in detail in an earlier account. Psamtik II had done something important but underappreciated. He had suppressed the last serious Kushite challenge to Ptolemaic authority in the south, conducting a military campaign into Nubia that pushed the former 25th dynasty pharaohs' ambitions back beyond a point from which they could realistically threaten Egypt, and simultaneously, in a deliberate act of cultural political erasure, commissioning the systematic defacement of Kushite royal monuments at Egyptian temple sites. By the time Apries came to the throne in approximately 589 BC, the Site dynasty was at the peak of its internal consolidation. The Nubian threat was managed. The Delta commercial networks were functioning. The Naucratis trading city was generating revenue and diplomatic connections. The mercenary communities, Ionian and Carian Greek soldiers and their descendants, settled in the Delta since Psamtik I's strategic deployments, were a professional military resource of considerable quality. The priestly establishments were maintained, and the royal cult was functioning. Egypt was, by virtually every contemporary measure, the most stable and most commercially sophisticated state in the eastern Mediterranean world, and Apries was ambitious. The ambitions of Apries expressed themselves in two primary directions. and understanding both is essential for understanding how his reign came to its specific end. The first direction was the Levant, the coastal strip of modern Lebanon, Israel, and Palestine that had been the contested zone of Egyptian-Mesopotamian imperial competition for most of the previous 2 centuries, and that continued to be strategically critical as the balance of power shifted from the Assyrian dominance of the 7th century BC to the Babylonian dominance of the 6th. Egypt's relationship with the Levantine states, particularly with the Phoenician city-states and with the Kingdom of Judah, had been one of the defining features of Site foreign policy since Necho II's campaigns. Apries continued this engagement, but in circumstances that were considerably more dangerous than those his predecessors had faced. The Babylonian Empire under Nebuchadnezzar II was, in the early 6th century BC, the dominant land power in the Near East. Nebuchadnezzar had already, as described in the account of Amasis in this series, destroyed Jerusalem and deported the Judean population to Babylon in the events of 587 BC. He was methodically extending Babylonian control over the Levantine coast. The Phoenician cities, Tyre, Sidon, and their sister cities, were under sustained Babylonian military pressure. The small kingdom of Judah was gone. The question for Egypt was not whether Babylonian power would reach the Levantine coast, but how Egypt would respond when it did. Apries' response was intervention. He sent Egyptian forces into the Levant. The timing and the scale of specific operations is a matter of some scholarly debate, and the fragmentary ancient sources do not always allow precise reconstruction of the sequence of events. In what appears to have been an attempt to support remaining anti-Babylonian resistance along the Levantine coast and to maintain Egyptian commercial and diplomatic influence in the region that Nebuchadnezzar was progressively absorbing. The most famous specific Egyptian military action in the Levant during Apries' reign is referenced in the Hebrew prophet Jeremiah's account. An Egyptian force marched toward Jerusalem during the Babylonian siege, temporarily causing the Babylonian forces to withdraw. Whether this represents a significant Egyptian military intervention or simply a feint that influenced Babylonian tactics without any lasting strategic consequence is debated. What Jeremiah's account makes clear is that the Egyptian intervention, however limited its immediate military effect, was real, and that the specific character of the Babylonian response demonstrated exactly how the Babylonian-Egyptian power relationship stood. The Babylonians withdrew temporarily, assessed the Egyptian force as insufficient to change the strategic situation, and returned to complete the siege and the destruction of Jerusalem. Egypt had shown up. Egypt had not changed the outcome. The second direction of Apries' ambition was westward, toward Libya and the Greek colonial world of the North African coast. This is the direction that eventually produced the catastrophe, but understanding why it was a plausible policy direction requires understanding the specific geography and politics of the Western Mediterranean in the early 6th century BC. The Libyan coast west of Egypt had been a zone of Egyptian commercial and political interest since the Site period began. The Libyan tribal confederations that occupied the territory between the Nile Delta and the Carthaginian sphere of influence were familiar presences in Egyptian diplomacy. More importantly for Apries' specific situation, the Greek colonial city of Cyrene, founded approximately 630 BC by Greek colonists from the Aegean island of Pharaoh, was by the early 6th century a prosperous and expanding commercial presence on the Libyan coast. Its expansion was generating conflict with the indigenous Libyan population and with the broader regional power dynamics that Egyptian foreign policy had to navigate. The specific precipitating event that sent Apries' army to Cyrene is described in ancient sources that are imperfect in their specific details, but consistent in their broad outlines. The Libyan king or leader appealed to Apries for support against the Greek colonists of Cyrene, who had been expanding their territory at the expense of the indigenous Libyan population. Apries, for reasons that the ancient sources explain with varying degrees of plausibility, chose to respond to this appeal by sending an Egyptian military force. Why? This is the question that requires careful attention, because the decision to intervene in Cyrene was not obviously irrational from the perspective of Apries' strategic situation. The Greek colonial world was expanding rapidly along the North African coast in the late 7th and early 6th centuries BC. Cyrene's growth represented a potential challenge to Egyptian commercial interests in the Western Mediterranean. Supporting the Libyan opponents of Greek colonial expansion was, from one angle, a defense of Egyptian interests against a competitor. It was also, from another angle, a demonstration to the indigenous Libyan population of Egyptian power and Egyptian willingness to support traditional allies against Greek encroachment. A demonstration that had diplomatic value in maintaining the network of relationships on which Egyptian commercial interests in the region depended. And from a third angle, the angle that the returning soldiers would later invoke against him. It was a way of deploying a native Egyptian military force in a distant campaign where its losses would weaken the specific demographic group within the army that Apries had reason to consider a potential threat to his authority. The third interpretation is the one that the ancient sources, particularly Herodotus, favor as the explanation of Apries' motivation. But the first two interpretations are not implausible, and the honest assessment of the evidence is that Apries probably had multiple motivations that he was himself not fully separating when he made the decision. Leaders rarely make clean strategic calculations of the kind that retrospective analysis prefers to find. They make decisions in conditions of complexity, uncertainty, and competing pressures, and the specific combination of considerations that produced any given decision is rarely visible from the outside. What is visible is the outcome. The Egyptian force sent to Cyrene was defeated. The Cyrenean Greeks, whatever specific tactical advantages they had, proved capable of inflicting a serious military defeat on the Egyptian army sent against them. The survivors returned to Egypt, and they brought their rage and their humiliation and their specific accusations against the pharaoh with them. The discovery moment for modern scholarly understanding of Apries came not from a single dramatic archaeological find, but from the patient accumulation of evidence across 2 centuries of Egyptological work, the gradual assembly, from papyri and inscriptions and comparative ancient sources, of a picture of the late Site period that placed Apries in his full context, rather than simply as the transitional figure between the better documented reigns of Necho II and Amasis. The scholar who has done the most systematic modern analysis of the Site period as a whole, Alan Lloyd, the British Egyptologist, whose work has appeared repeatedly in this series as the foundational scholarly authority on late-period Egypt, described Apries in his comprehensive study of the 26th dynasty as one of the most interesting but most difficult pharaohs of the period to assess. The difficulty, Lloyd noted, is that the primary ancient sources, Herodotus and the fragmentary Hebrew prophetic literature, each bring their own specific agendas to the portrayal of Apries, agendas that shape what they emphasize, what they ignore, and how they explain the specific events of his reign. Herodotus was writing a century and a half after Apries, drawing on oral traditions and temple records that had been filtered through the reign of Amasis, the man who overthrew Apries, and through the subsequent Ptolemaic period that celebrated Amasis as one of the most successful pharaohs of the late period. Herodotus's account of Apries is inevitably shaped by this retrospective perspective. The reign of a man who was overthrown and replaced by a more successful successor tends to be interpreted, in retrospect, as a series of errors and failures rather than as a genuinely capable governance that encountered specific structural problems at a specific moment of political vulnerability. The Hebrew prophetic literature, Jeremiah's oracles against Egypt in particular, sees Apries through the lens of Judean theology, as the pharaoh whose military intervention in the Levant failed to save Jerusalem, whose armies were turned back, whose power was insufficient against the divine judgment that the prophets attributed to the Babylonian advance. This perspective, however valuable as primary evidence for the Egyptian military activities in the Levant, is not a neutral assessment of Apries as a ruler. Reading through both sets of sources and reading around them, to the extent that the archaeological and papyrological evidence allows, produces a picture of a ruler of genuine capability and genuine ambition, operating in a strategic environment that was, in specific and important ways, more difficult than the one his predecessors had navigated. The failure was real, but the failure was not simply personal inadequacy. It was the product of specific structural tensions that the Site period's inherent contradictions had been building toward since the dynasty's founding. Understanding those contradictions is the central task of this account. The structural tensions of the Site period were, at their core, tensions between the two defining characteristics of the dynasty: its deep-rootedness in the Egyptian pharaonic tradition and its equally deep engagement with the Greek and Phoenician commercial world of the Mediterranean. These characteristics were not simply different aspects of the same political program. They were, in certain specific ways, in genuine tension with each other. The pharaonic tradition required a specific kind of authority: the divine kingship, the maintenance of the priestly establishments, the performance of the ritual obligations that connected the ruler to the theological framework of Egyptian civilization. This authority was, in principle, native, rooted in the specific Egyptian institutional landscape that had sustained pharaonic power for 3,000 years. The Mediterranean engagement required a different kind of capability: the maintenance of Greek mercenary forces, the cultivation of commercial relationships with Greek and Phoenician trading partners, the diplomatic management of a wider world in which Greek-speaking city-states were becoming increasingly powerful and increasingly present in the Eastern Mediterranean commercial networks. This capability was, in many ways, foreign. It depended on institutions and relationships that were not organic to the Egyptian pharaonic tradition, but had been grafted onto it by the Sete dynasty's founding generation. Psamtik I had managed this tension with extraordinary skill, partly because he was the man who had created the hybrid from scratch and therefore understood its internal structure better than anyone who inherited it could. The Greek mercenaries he settled in the Delta were his instrument, his creation, responsive to his authority, calibrated to his strategic needs. The relationship between the native Egyptian military tradition and the Greek mercenary component of the Sete army was something he had designed, and he managed the design with the care of a builder who understood every joint in the structure. By the time of Apries, 3 generations later, the relationship was no longer something that the pharaoh had designed. It was an inherited institutional arrangement with its own history, its own internal dynamics, and its own specific tensions that had been accumulating across 3 generations. The Greek and Carian mercenary communities in the Delta were by now established communities, not simply soldiers for hire, but families with deep local roots, economic interests, cultural practices, and community identity that had developed across more than a century of settlement. They were not simply instruments of the pharaoh's strategic will. They were an interest group with their own stake in the arrangements that governed their relationship to the Egyptian state. The native Egyptian military component, the troops who formed the infantry backbone of the army, and who came from the traditional warrior classes of the Egyptian population, had their own accumulated identity and their own accumulated grievances about the relationship between themselves and the Greek professional soldiers, who were paid better, treated differently, and wielded a different kind of influence over the strategic decisions of the pharaoh's court. The charge that the ancient sources report the soldiers making against Apries, that he had deliberately sent native Egyptian soldiers to their deaths to reduce the military challenge they might pose to his authority, is the specific expression of an institutional tension that had been building throughout the dynasty. Whether Apries actually thought in these terms, whether the decision to send the army to Cyrene was shaped by a calculation about reducing the native Egyptian military's power, is, as noted above, impossible to determine. But the fact that the soldiers believed it is itself evidence that the institutional tension was real and had been accumulating to a point where the specific disaster of the Cyrene defeat provided the trigger for its explosive release. The scale of the defeat matters for understanding how the release happened when it did. A minor military setback, a tactical defeat in a campaign that ended with a strategic draw or a negotiated outcome, would not have produced the specific emotional conditions for a revolt. What the returning soldiers brought back from Cyrene was not simply frustration with an unsuccessful campaign. They brought back the specific humiliation of a serious defeat, the loss of comrades, the experience of being outfought by Greek colonial soldiers who were, in the soldiers' own self-understanding, a less capable and less legitimate military force than themselves. They brought back the specific indignity of failing at a task that the Pharaoh had assigned to them, and that they had been told they should be capable of performing. The combination of military humiliation, loss of comrades, and the specific accusation that the humiliation had been engineered rather than accidental. This was the specific emotional and political combustion that the Cyrene defeat produced. And it was combustion that was already looking for a spark before Amasis arrived to be that spark. The math is striking when placed against the backdrop of the Sete dynasty's entire history. 3 generations of carefully managed balance between native Egyptian and Greek mercenary components of the military, between pharaonic legitimacy and Mediterranean commercial engagement, between the traditional institutional claims of the Egyptian priestly establishment and the cosmopolitan requirements of a dynasty that operated at the junction of 2 worlds. And then, in a single poorly chosen military intervention, 19 years of Apries' relatively capable governance were dismantled in the time it took an army to march home from Libya. 3 generations of careful building undone by 1 campaign. This is the specific lesson that Apries' reign offers. Not a lesson about individual failure, but a lesson about the structural vulnerabilities that the Site period's inherent tensions created, and the specific conditions under which those vulnerabilities could be triggered into active political crisis. The ancient historian Diodorus Siculus, writing in the 1st century BC, preserved a tradition about Apries that is worth noting here as background. He records that Apries was described by his contemporaries as a ruler who was proud, prideful in the specific ancient sense of the word that implied a dangerous confidence in the security of his position. The ancient sources record him as saying, in terms that various accounts preserve in slightly different versions, that no god or man could remove him from his throne. This kind of statement, attributed to a ruler who is then very dramatically removed from his throne, has the quality of an anecdote improved by its ironic outcome, the kind of story that gets attached to historical figures in retrospect to explain why their fall was deserved. Whether Apries actually said anything like this is impossible to verify, but the tradition of the statement tells us something about how his reign was understood by subsequent generations, as the reign of a man who had confused the security of his position with its permanence, who had mistaken the specific stability of the Site period's accumulated achievements for an invulnerability, that the accumulated tensions of the period's inherent contradictions were always preparing to challenge. The Pharaoh who lost to the Greeks lost not simply on the battlefield at Cyrene. He lost in the accumulated institutional tensions that the defeat triggered. The battle was the spark. The fire was already there. Now this account turns to the full examination of how the fire built, and how, when it finally ignited, it consumed the reign of one of the most ambitious pharaohs of the late period in less time than it had taken to build the conditions for it. The world of the early 6th century BC Mediterranean, the world Apries was navigating, was experiencing a rate of political and military transformation that made every strategic calculation from the previous generation potentially obsolete. The collapse of the Assyrian Empire in the 610s BDC had removed the dominant land power that had structured Near Eastern politics for 3 centuries. The Babylonian Empire had risen to fill part of the vacuum, but with different methods and different geographic priorities than the Assyrian system. The Greek colonial expansion was extending Greek-speaking populations and Greek commercial networks across the entire Mediterranean basin, from the Black Sea to the Iberian Peninsula. The Lydian kingdom in western Anatolia, the kingdom of Croesus, whose legendary wealth represented the prosperity of the most commercially sophisticated state in the region outside Egypt itself, was in the process of being absorbed by the rising power of Persia. Apries was watching all of this from the delta. He was receiving ambassadors and intelligence reports and commercial information from across the eastern Mediterranean world. He was managing a diplomatic correspondence that reached from the Babylonian court to the Greek city-states, to the Levantine coastal cities, to the Libyan tribal leaders. He was, by any reasonable standard, one of the better-informed rulers in the ancient world about the specific shape of the strategic environment he was operating in. And yet the Cyrene disaster happened. And when it happened, 19 years of governance were undone. This is the specific irony that makes Apries one of the most instructive figures in the history of the Site period. A ruler who was, by the evidence of his sustained and energetic foreign policy, more strategically aware and more internationally engaged than almost any other pharaoh of the dynasty, and who fell because the specific structural tensions of his own kingdom's institutional inheritance were more dangerous than the external threats he was so carefully monitoring. The external world did not destroy Apries, his own army did. That distinction between the external and the internal source of his fall is the specific lesson that the full accounting of his reign makes most clearly visible. It is a distinction worth holding on to throughout the following sections, which trace the specific events of his reign in the detail they deserve. The foundation is established, the scale is set, the contradictions are named. Now the story begins to move. The 26th dynasty of Egypt was, as described throughout this series, a dynasty built on a specific political formula. Greek military expertise in service of native Egyptian royal legitimacy, producing a kingdom capable of competing in the increasingly complex commercial and diplomatic landscape of the 6th century BC Mediterranean, while maintaining the internal stability that 3,000 years of pharaonic tradition could provide. Psamtik I had assembled this formula with the patience and intelligence of a founding genius. His successors had developed it, extended it, and refined it across 3 additional reigns. Apries was the 4th ruler of this formula. He was also, as the events of 570 BC would demonstrate, the ruler under whose reign the formula first showed its specific internal fault lines in a way that could not be contained. The fault lines were not caused by Apries. They were structural, inherent in the specific character of the institutional hybrid that the Site period represented. Apries' specific choices triggered their expression. But the expression was always coming. The question was only when, and under what specific circumstances, and with what specific consequences. The answer to all 3 questions is the story of Apries, and that story, in its full complexity, is the subject of the sections that follow. The dynasty's founding vision, the internal tensions it had always carried, the external pressures that were building throughout his reign, the specific military disaster that provided the trigger, and the specific human and political dynamics through which that trigger ignited the explosion that ended his reign and began the reign of his more capable successor. The pharaoh who lost to the Greeks lost more than a battle. He lost the institutional equilibrium that his dynasty had been carefully maintaining for 3 generations. Understanding how that equilibrium was lost, and what the losing of it reveals about the Site period's most fundamental tensions, is the deepest purpose of this account. That purpose begins to unfold now. One more element of the foundation deserves attention before the story fully moves into Apries' specific reign, the specific character of the Site military that he inherited, and that was to prove both his most important strategic resource and the instrument of his eventual destruction. The Site military was, by the early 6th century BC, a genuinely sophisticated combined arms force, not the crude levies of peasants and archers that the romantic imagination tends to project onto ancient armies, but a professional organization with specialized units, institutional traditions, and a specific internal culture that had been developing since Psamtik I's founding deployments. At its core were the Greek and Carian mercenary regiments, soldiers trained in the phalanx and related formations, equipped with the best available Greek weaponry and maintained in their delta settlements as a permanent professional military resource. Supplementing them were native Egyptian infantry forces recruited from the traditional warrior communities of the Nile Valley, the charioteers whose role had diminished but not disappeared from Egyptian military practice. the naval forces that Necho II had built and his successors had maintained, and the various specialized forces that a large and complex military organization accumulated over time. This military had, before the Cyrene disaster, a genuinely impressive record. It had won the Battle of Megiddo under Necho. It had conducted the Nubian campaigns under Psamtik II. It had managed the complex military requirements of state diplomacy with the Greek world and the Levantine states for more than half a century. It was not a weak force. It was not a force that had any reasonable expectation of failing against Greek colonial soldiers in Libya. The defeat at Cyrene was therefore not simply a military defeat. It was a shock, a demonstration that the military formula on which the Sate state had been built was not invulnerable, that the Greek mercenary expertise that the dynasty had always cultivated as a strategic resource could be matched, in the right circumstances and with the right opposition, by forces that the dynasty had not anticipated needing to treat as a serious military challenge. That shock was the psychological foundation for everything that followed. The soldiers who came home from Cyrene were not simply defeated soldiers. They were soldiers whose world had been structurally disrupted, soldiers whose specific understanding of the military balance of power had been challenged in ways they had not anticipated and could not immediately assimilate. Add to this disruption the specific accusation about Apries' motivations, and the political combustion that produced the revolt becomes not just explicable, but almost inevitable in retrospect. The conditions for it were perfectly assembled. The only question was what specific act would serve as the trigger. Amasis was the trigger. The rest, as the ancient sources record with varying degrees of detail, followed with the speed and the force of a long-delayed release. The full accounting begins now. The core problem of Apries' reign was not Cyrene. Cyrene was the occasion. The core problem was the specific structural vulnerability that the Sate dynasty had been carrying since its founding. The vulnerability that lay at the intersection of the dynasty's most characteristic strength and its most characteristic weakness. The strength was the Greek military connection. From Psamtik I's original deployment of Ionian and Carian mercenaries as the decisive professional core of his military force, the Sate dynasty had built and maintained its military effectiveness on the specific quality and reliability of Greek professional soldiers. The Greek mercenary communities in the Delta, settled there since the dynasty's founding, established in their own camps, maintaining their own cultural identity, fighting in their own formations, were the element of the Sate military that the dynasty's strategic planners could most confidently deploy as a high-quality professional force in the complex military operations that the 6th century BC Mediterranean required. The weakness was the specific dynamic this military structure created within the kingdom. An army that depends on foreign professional soldiers for its most reliable military capability is an army in which the native components, whatever their numbers and whatever their traditional military culture, are structurally secondary. The native Egyptian military tradition, which had sustained the pharaonic state for 3,000 years before the Sate dynasty's Greek military connection, was still present and still important, but it was not dominant in the way it had been under the New Kingdom pharaohs, who had won their great battles with overwhelmingly native forces. This was not a secret. It was not a conspiracy. It was the visible institutional reality of the Sate military, which everyone who served in it or thought about it had reason to understand. The Greek mercenaries were paid better. They were deployed in the most professional and most prestigious formations. They were the soldiers Pharaoh's court most trusted for the most sensitive operations. The native Egyptian soldiers knew all of this. They had known it for 3 generations. The knowledge had been accumulating. What Cyrene did was not create this knowledge. What Cyrene did was provide a specific, visceral, emotionally overwhelming confirmation of it. The confirmation of soldiers who believed they had been sent to die, precisely because they were not the Greek mercenaries, precisely because their expendability was built into the structural logic of the dynasty's military priorities. But here's the problem, and it runs deeper than the military structure, the specific political charge that the returning soldiers made against Apries. the charge of deliberate expendability, of the pharaoh using them as a tool of his own security by sending them to a defeat from which they would return weakened, was not simply a military grievance. It was a political claim about the fundamental legitimacy of the pharaoh's relationship to his own people. The pharaoh, in the 3,000-year tradition of Egyptian divine kingship, was not simply a ruler who commanded armies and extracted taxes. The pharaoh was the living Horus, the embodiment of divine order, the intermediate between the human world and the divine, the figure whose primary obligation was to maintain Mat, the cosmic principle of right relationship and right order. The pharaoh's obligation to the native Egyptian population was not simply the political obligation of a ruler to his subjects. It was a theological obligation, the obligation of the living God to the people in whose service the divine power was exercised. An accusation that the pharaoh had deliberately sacrificed his own native soldiers for personal political advantage was, in the Egyptian theological framework, not simply a political accusation. It was a theological one. It was the claim that the pharaoh had violated the most fundamental obligation of his divine office, that he had placed his own security above the welfare of the people he was cosmically obligated to serve and protect. This theological dimension of the accusation gave it a weight that purely political charges would not have carried, and it connected the Cyrene disaster to a broader set of observations about Apries' reign that were already circulating, about the specific favoritism toward the Greek mercenary community, about the personal bodyguard of Greek and Carian soldiers that the ancient sources describe as a characteristic feature of Apries' court, about the specific orientation of his foreign policy toward Greek commercial and military interests, rather than toward the traditional Egyptian institutional priorities. The accumulation of these observations, some accurate, some exaggerated, some simply the standard grievances that political opponents assemble against any ruler, produced, in the specific emotional conditions of the Cyrene defeat, a narrative about Apries that made sense of his entire reign as a coherent pattern of betrayal rather than simply as a series of political choices that had an unfortunate outcome. And it gets worse. The specific reason the narrative was so powerful was that it had enough truth in it to be compelling, even to people who might, in less emotionally charged circumstances, have recognized its exaggerations. Apries did rely heavily on Greek professional soldiers. Apries did maintain a Greek bodyguard. Apries did pursue a foreign policy that was heavily engaged with the Greek world and that, in specific cases, prioritized Greek commercial and diplomatic interests in ways that were visible to the native Egyptian population. The narrative was not pure invention. It was selective truth, truth organized to produce a specific interpretation of a complex set of facts. But the selection was effective precisely because the raw material was genuine. The philosopher-historian Polybius, writing several centuries later in a different context, articulated a principle that applies precisely to Apries' situation, that the most dangerous political crises are not those produced by pure injustice, which tends to produce clear lines of opposition and clear grounds of defense, but those produced by the appearance of injustice in a context where enough genuine injustice exists to make the appearance compelling. Apries' situation was exactly of this type. There was enough genuine basis for the charge against him that defending himself against it required the kind of nuanced political argument that an army already burning with humiliation and grief was not in a position to hear. He sent Amasis to make the nuanced argument. Amasis assessed the situation and decided that a different kind of argument was more appropriate. He mounted his horse, accepted the crown, and rode to the capital. What followed was not immediate or uncomplicated. The ancient sources record that the confrontation between Apries and Amasis was not settled in a single dramatic moment. Apries had his loyal forces, the Greek mercenaries in particular, whose institutional loyalty to the pharaoh was based on a different calculation than the native soldiers' grievances, and who had no particular reason to align with the native rebellion against a pharaoh who was, from their perspective, their patron and their employer. The conflict between Apries and Amasis extended across a period of what may have been months or even a year or more, with both sides maintaining military forces and maneuvering for political advantage. The turning point came at the Battle of Memphis, a confrontation in the delta that the ancient sources describe with varying levels of specificity, in which the forces of Amasis defeated the forces of Apries in an engagement that was, by the accounts, decisive in its military outcome. Apries fled or was captured. The ancient sources record conflicting accounts of what happened next. Herodotus says Amasis had him strangled, but Herodotus also records that he heard another version, that the Egyptian people themselves killed Apries after Amasis had handed him over to them. A third version suggests Apries died in a later attempt to recover his throne with Babylonian support. The uncertainty about the specific manner of his death reflects the general character of the evidence for Apries' reign, specific enough to give the broad outlines, fragmentary enough that the specific details remain contested. What is not contested is the outcome. Apries was dead, his reign was over, and Amasis had begun the 44-year rule that this series has already described in the account devoted to him. But before accepting the fall of Apries as simply the inevitable consequence of his specific failures, this account needs to examine what he actually built across the 19 years of his reign. Because the building was real, and the building deserves attention that the dramatic failure at the end has consistently prevented it from receiving. Apries ruled for 19 years. 19 years of actively managed foreign policy, of sustained commercial and diplomatic engagement across the Eastern Mediterranean world, of domestic administration of a kingdom that was, by the evidence of the surviving records, functioning at a genuinely high level. He was not simply the Pharaoh who sent his army to Cyrene and watched it come home in pieces. He was a ruler who, for the first 15 years or so of his reign, was doing what his dynasty had always done, navigating a complex world with the specific combination of pharaonic legitimacy and Hellenistic commercial intelligence that the Sate formula required. The specific achievements of those 15 years deserve their accounting, and the relationship between those achievements and the final crisis, the specific way in which the building of his reign created, or failed to prevent, the conditions for his fall, is the most instructive thing this account can offer about the structural vulnerabilities of the Sate period's most ambitious phase. The accounting follows. The Levantine engagements of Apries' reign require closer examination because they represent the most sustained and the most politically consequential dimension of his foreign policy, and because the relationship between those engagements and the Cyrene disaster is less obvious than a superficial reading of the events suggests. The specific context for Egyptian involvement in the Levant during Apries' reign was the Babylonian advance under Nebuchadnezzar II. By the time Apries came to the throne, in 589 BC, the Babylonian Empire had already established itself as the dominant land power in the Near East, and was progressively extending its control over the Levantine coastal states that had, under the Assyrian system and during the Sate period of Egyptian Levantine engagement, been part of a more complex regional political landscape. The Kingdom of Judah, in particular, was in a crisis that the ancient sources, specifically the Hebrew prophetic literature, and most importantly, the books of Jeremiah and Ezekiel, document in considerable detail. Judah was caught between the competing pressures of Babylonian dominance and the residual possibility of Egyptian support. Zedekiah, the last king of Judah, made the fateful decision to rebel against Babylonian authority in approximately 589 BC, a decision that the prophet Jeremiah specifically opposed on the grounds that the Babylonian power was too overwhelming for Egyptian support to be adequate. Jeremiah was right. The Babylonian siege of Jerusalem began in approximately 588 BC. An Egyptian force, specifically a military intervention by the Egyptian army under Apries' command, or at least dispatched by Apries, advanced toward Jerusalem in a manner that the Babylonian Chronicle and the Hebrew prophetic literature both record. The Babylonians temporarily raised the siege and turned to deal with the Egyptian advance, and then, when the Egyptian force withdrew or was insufficient to sustain its advance, the Babylonians returned and completed the siege. Jerusalem fell in 587 BC. The temple was destroyed, The population was deported to Babylon. The kingdom of Judah ceased to exist as a political entity. The Egyptian intervention in the Judean crisis is one of the most contested events in the historical scholarship of the Site period, because the surviving sources, the Babylonian Chronicle, the Hebrew Bible, the Greek accounts, each present it from a perspective that is shaped by their specific concerns and their specific interpretive frameworks. The Babylonian Chronicle treats it as a minor episode in the larger narrative of Babylonian military success. The Hebrew Bible treats it as evidence of the inadequacy of trusting Egypt against the divine judgment executed through the Babylonian advance. Hence Jeremiah's famous oracle about Egypt as a staff of reed that breaks when leaned upon. Herodotus barely mentions it. What the academic specialist Alan Lloyd, in his systematic analysis of the Site period, describes as the best available reconstruction of what actually happened is essentially this. Apries did attempt a Levantine intervention. He sent military forces toward Palestine. The intervention was insufficient to the specific military challenge it faced. The Babylonian army was a more formidable opponent than any force Egypt could have sent north in the conditions of 588 BC. The intervention failed to save Judah, and the failure was politically significant not because it represented a major military defeat for Egypt, but because it demonstrated to the careful observer that Egyptian Levantine ambitions had outrun Egyptian Levantine capability. This is a significant finding. It means that the specific problem of Apries' reign was not simply the Cyrene disaster. The Cyrene disaster was the catastrophic, army-wrecking, revolt-triggering expression of a more general problem. The general problem was the gap between Apries' ambition to project Egyptian power and influence across the eastern Mediterranean world and the specific military and diplomatic capacity that the state could actually deploy to support that ambition. The gap was not enormous. It was not the catastrophic overreach of a ruler who had wildly miscalculated the resources available to him. It was a small gap. The gap between capability and ambition that accumulates gradually across a reign of 19 years through a series of small decisions, each of which seemed individually defensible, producing a cumulative extension of commitments that left the state strategically overextended at the specific moment when it needed to absorb a major shock. The Levantine failure was the accumulation. The Cyrene disaster was the shock. And the accumulated overextension provided no buffer to absorb the shock when it arrived. Understanding this dynamic, the gradual accumulation of strategic overextension that characterizes the reigns of ambitious rulers operating close to the edge of what their resources can support, is one of the most practically useful things that the study of Apries' reign can offer. It is a dynamic that appears in the history of multiple civilizations and multiple eras, and its recognition in the Site period gives it a specific ancient form that illuminates the general pattern. The specific personal qualities of Apries contributed to the dynamic in ways that are visible in the ancient sources. The pride attributed to him, the specific overconfidence about the security of his position, is a quality that the ancient sources tend to present as a personal failing, a character flaw, a tragic hubris. But it can also be read as a specific cognitive bias that the structural conditions of his reign made almost inevitable. A ruler who had, for 15 years, been successfully navigating a complex and demanding strategic environment without a major failure is a ruler who has accumulated specific evidence that his approach to governance is working. The evidence pointed one way. The structural vulnerabilities were invisible to the evidence because they had not yet been triggered until Cyrene. The ancient world understood hubris as a specific theological category, the overreach that provoked divine punishment, the human presumption that violated the proper limits of the human and invited the divine correction. The theological category describes a genuine psychological pattern, the specific way in which success produces a reduced sensitivity to the specific risks that the successful person is still taking. Apries was not uniquely afflicted with this pattern. He was afflicted in a specific historical moment when the pattern had specific consequences that were historically significant enough to record. There is one more dimension of the core problem that this section must address, and it concerns the specific role of the prophet Jeremiah's oracles in the historical record of Apries' reign. The oracle against Egypt in Jeremiah chapter 46 is one of the most vivid pieces of ancient political commentary from the period. It describes, in the language of prophetic vision, the Egyptian army assembling for campaign, the multitude of soldiers, the variety of equipment, the specific nations represented in the diverse mercenary force, and then, in a dramatic reversal, the failure of the army and the retreat of Egypt before the Babylonian advance. The imagery is powerful. The Egyptian army as a great flood that rises and rushes forward, and then is turned back, receding in confusion and defeat. The oracle's specific language, describing Egypt as a beautiful heifer threatened by a gadfly from the north, as a reed staff that breaks when a wounded soldier leans on it, has been read as a specific condemnation of Egyptian political unreliability from the perspective of Judah, which had looked to Egypt for support and found the support inadequate. But it can also be read as an accurate strategic assessment. Egypt in the early 6th century BC was indeed a kingdom whose military reach had, in the specific circumstances of the Babylonian advance, exceeded its military grasp. The beautiful Haifa was genuinely beautiful. The Haifa was also genuinely incapable of stopping the Babylonian army. Jeremiah understood this. He argued, on theological grounds, that Judah should accept Babylonian dominance rather than looking to Egypt for deliverance. His argument was based on his specific theology, the conviction that the Babylonian advance was divine punishment for Judean sin, against which no human political solution was adequate. But his political assessment was correct regardless of the theology. Egypt was not going to save Judah, not because Egypt was malicious or incompetent, but because Babylonian military power in the early 6th century BC was more than Egyptian military power could overcome. The irony is that Jeremiah's oracle against Egypt, his specific assessment of Apries' kingdom as a broken reed, has shaped how Apries has been understood by subsequent generations far more than any specifically Egyptian source. The Hebrew prophetic tradition's specific verdict on Apries is the verdict that most Western readers encounter first, because the biblical sources are the most widely read documents from the ancient Near East of this period. The verdict is not false, but it is partial, shaped by the specific perspective of a people for whom Egypt's failure was an immediate political catastrophe, and who naturally interpreted that failure in terms of Egyptian inadequacy, rather than in terms of the specific structural pressures that were acting on both Egypt and Judah simultaneously. The full picture requires reading Jeremiah alongside Herodotus, alongside the Babylonian Chronicle, alongside the surviving Egyptian administrative evidence, and the full picture is considerably more complex and considerably more sympathetic to Apries than the partial picture that any single source provides. That complexity is what the following sections explore. The exploration is not a rehabilitation of Apries. His reign did end in catastrophic defeat and an army revolt that overthrew him, but it is an honest assessment of a ruler who was, for most of his reign, doing something genuinely difficult in genuinely difficult conditions, and who deserves the full accounting that the silence around him has too long withheld. The Phoenician dimension of Apries' Levantine engagements has been less discussed in scholarship than the Judean dimension, partly because the Hebrew biblical sources are more accessible to most scholars, and partly because the Phoenician evidence is more fragmentary. But the Phoenician coast was at least as important to Apries' strategic calculations as Judah, possibly more important, given that the Phoenician city-states were the primary commercial maritime power in the eastern Mediterranean, and that their relationship to Egyptian commercial interests was therefore more directly consequential for the state-state's economic foundation. Tyre, the greatest of the Phoenician cities, was under Babylonian siege, a siege that ancient sources record as lasting 13 years, though the specific dating and the specific circumstances of its eventual resolution are matters of scholarly debate. The extent and the character of Apries' engagement with Tyre during this siege, whether Egypt sent military support, whether Apries used the Tyrian crisis as an opportunity to extend Egyptian naval presence in the eastern Mediterranean, Whether there was diplomatic engagement between Alexandria and the Tyrian court is not fully clear from the surviving evidence. What is clear is that the loss of Phoenician commercial independence to Babylonian dominance would have been a direct economic threat to Egyptian commercial interests. The Phoenicians were the primary middlemen in the Eastern Mediterranean commercial network. Their subjugation by Babylon would have restructured the commercial geography of the region in ways that disadvantaged Egypt's position as a trading hub. Apries had every reason to be concerned about the Phoenician situation, and the ancient sources suggest that he was actively engaged with it, even if the specific nature of his engagement cannot be fully reconstructed. This broader commercial strategic context is important for understanding why Apries made the choices he made. He was not simply a ruler intervening in the political crises of his neighbors out of ideological commitment or dynastic solidarity. He was a ruler managing a kingdom whose economic foundations depended on the maintenance of specific commercial relationships across the Eastern Mediterranean world, relationships that the Babylonian advance was systematically threatening. Every intervention was, from this perspective, a defense of Egyptian commercial interests, as much as a diplomatic or ideological act. This commercial strategic logic is not the logic that the ancient sources emphasize. Herodotus is interested in the personal and political drama. Jeremiah is interested in the theological implications. Neither is primarily interested in the commercial strategic calculation that was presumably driving Egyptian decision-making in the early 6th century BC. But the commercial strategic logic is real, and its presence in Apries' decision-making, the specific way in which the pharaoh was trying to protect Egyptian economic interests by maintaining Egyptian political engagement in the Levant, is a dimension of his reign that a comprehensive assessment requires. The core problem, then, has three interlocking dimensions: the structural tension within the State military between its Greek professional component and its native Egyptian component, the strategic overextension of Apries' foreign policy ambitions relative to the specific capacity of the site-state to support them, and the specific moment of the Cyrene disaster that triggered the accumulated institutional tensions of both of these dimensions simultaneously. These three interlocking dimensions are what make Apries' reign one of the most instructive case studies in the entire history of the late period, a case study not in simple failure, but in the specific, structurally driven, contextually produced failure that the most capable and most ambitious rulers tend to experience when the institutional contradictions of their own position reach the specific threshold at which they can no longer be managed. The threshold was Cyrene. The failure was specific, structural, and historically significant, and it produced, in its immediate aftermath, a reign, Amasis' 44 years, that was better in many specific ways, precisely because Amasis had watched Apries make the specific errors that the Site dynasty's structural tensions most dangerously invited, and had learned from them with the intelligence and the specific personal qualities that this series has already described. The failure of Apries was the condition of possibility for the success of Amasis. This is the most important legacy of the reign of the pharaoh who lost to the Greeks. But the full accounting of that reign, its achievements and its failures, its ambitions and its specific structural vulnerabilities, requires the sustained examination of the sections that follow. The ancient sources disagree, as they often do, about the specific chronology and the specific causal relationships among the events of Apries' reign, but they agree on the essential structure. A reign of genuine ambition, extending Egyptian power across the Eastern Mediterranean in multiple directions simultaneously, sustained for most of its 19 years by the specific combination of Egyptian resources and institutional competence that the Seti formula provided, and then undone with devastating swiftness by the specific combination of a military disaster and an institutional rupture that the Seti formula had always been structurally vulnerable to producing. The essential structure is the lesson. The specific events are the evidence for the structure, and the sections that follow examine both the events in their specific detail and the structure in its full complexity. The pharaoh who lost to the Greeks was, in the end, a pharaoh who lost to himself. to the specific contradictions of the institutional inheritance he had received, the specific ambitions he had pursued, and the specific moment of crisis that revealed those contradictions with the brutal clarity that only a military catastrophe can provide. That revelation is the core problem. That problem is what this account explores. The ancient Egyptian temple of Neith at Sais, the great goddess who was the protective deity of the Sidon dynasty, whose temple was the religious center of the 26th dynasty's capital city, received no new major construction under Apries. The archaeological record of his reign at the major sacred sites is thinner than those of his predecessors and his successor. This is not simply a matter of the specific survival of evidence. It reflects something about the character of his reign. A pharaoh focused outward on the eastern Mediterranean world and its specific diplomatic and military challenges, rather than inward, on the specifically Egyptian institutional foundations that the dynasty's legitimacy depended on. Whether this outward focus was a cause of his eventual vulnerability, or simply a correlate of it, whether the specific neglect of domestic institutional investment created the conditions for the revolt, or whether the revolt would have come regardless from the accumulated structural tensions, is not entirely clear, but the pattern is visible. And it adds one more dimension to the core problem: the specific ways in which a ruler's attention to the external world can produce a corresponding inattention to the internal world that sustains his authority. Apries was looking outward when the fire started at home. That is the final element of the core problem, and it is the element that the following sections are best positioned to illuminate. The examination of those sections begins with the specific moment that the popular understanding of Apries most recognizes, the Cyrene disaster and its immediate aftermath, and then works backward to understand the full 19 years of the reign that made the disaster both possible and politically explosive when it arrived. Forward and backward simultaneously, the way that any proper historical accounting of a complex figure must work if it is to produce genuine understanding rather than simply a narrative of events. The Pharaoh who lost to the Greeks deserves that kind of accounting. He has not received it in the popular historical literature. This account provides it now. The accounting is now about to begin in full. The chapters of specific exploration follow. The Pharaoh who lost to the Greeks, examined in the specific detail his reign deserves, becomes visible as something more than a footnote between two more celebrated rulers. He becomes what he actually was, a complex, ambitious, ultimately overextended ruler whose specific failure illuminates the specific structural vulnerabilities of one of the most remarkable dynasties in the history of the ancient world. That illumination is the point. That illumination is the value of this account. The light falls on Apries now. He was the fourth king of the Sidon dynasty. He ruled Egypt for 19 years. He intervened in Judea and in Libya and in Phoenicia and in the larger eastern Mediterranean world with an energy and an ambition that few rulers of his era could match. He maintained Greek mercenaries and cultivated Greek commercial relationships and presided over a court of genuine cosmopolitan sophistication. And he was overthrown by his own army after a single military disaster, replaced by a general he had trusted enough to send to calm a revolt, who calmly decided that calming the revolt was less interesting than leading it. His name was Apries. His life ended in a medieval wall, in a sense, in the specific story that the ancient sources tell about a man who looked outward so far that he failed to see what was happening right beside him. The story is worth telling in full. The full telling begins now. The full telling requires the full evidence. The full evidence requires the full examination. And the full examination is what Section 4 provides. Every chapter of the exploration that follows has been assembled to give Apries the accounting his reign deserves, and to give the Pharaoh who lost to the Greeks his full story, from the beginning of the ambition to the end of the reign. Now the story fully opens. The Pharaoh who looked outward while the fire burned inward, the dynasty that had always been a hybrid discovering, at a specific moment of catastrophic stress, that the hybrid's internal tensions were more dangerous than any external enemy it had yet faced. The story of the Pharaoh who lost to the Greeks is the story of all of this, told in the full complexity it deserves. Complexity begins now. In 570 BC, the army came home from Cyrene and everything changed. The following chapters explain why everything had to change, why the specific structure of the Sai dynasty's hybrid formula made this kind of change inevitable once the right trigger was pulled, and why the pharaoh who pulled the trigger was not the Greek soldiers who defeated his army, but the accumulated institutional tensions that 19 years of outward-looking ambition had been building toward without resolution. Those chapters begin with a soldier named Amasis, sent to stop a revolt, who became the revolt. That is where the deeper exploration starts. The soldier became the pharaoh became a memory, and the memory, reconstructed carefully from the fragments the ancient sources provide, is what this account attempts to restore. The restoration begins in Chapter 1 of Section 4. Chapter 1. The Man Who Would Not Be Calmed. The specific moment when Amasis arrived in the camp of the disaffected soldiers and decided not to calm them is one of the most revealing episodes in the entire history of the Sidon dynasty. Revealing not because it tells us something dramatic about a single individual's ambition, but because it illuminates the specific institutional logic that governed military politics in the Sidon state. Amasis was not young when this happened. He was, by ancient estimates, already past middle age, a man with substantial military experience, a record of service under the dynasty, and the specific kind of knowledge about the internal dynamics of the Egyptian military that comes from a career spent in it. He would have arrived at the camp knowing precisely what he would find. Soldiers burning with the specific combination of military humiliation and political accusation that the Cyrene disaster had produced. He would have understood, from the moment he saw the camp, that the situation was already beyond the threshold of standard calming measures. What Herodotus records as the decisive moment, the soldiers placing a helmet on Amasis's head in a symbolic proclamation, was probably not a surprise to Amasis. The proclamation of a general by an army was one of the most well-established forms of political transition in the ancient world. Amasis had been around military politics long enough to understand the gesture's significance and the speed and completeness with which he accepted the proclamation suggests that he had at least considered the possibility before he arrived in the camp. This does not make him a conspirator in the simple sense. It makes him a man who saw the specific political moment clearly and acted with the decisiveness that political moments of this kind require. The decision was made in the camp, in the specific conditions of the soldier's rage and the dynasty's vulnerability, with the specific intelligence of a man who understood that refusing the proclamation was not the only alternative to accepting it. The ancient sources suggest that after the proclamation, Amasis sent a message to Apries, telling the pharaoh that he was now leading the rebel army rather than suppressing it, and that Apries should prepare for a military confrontation. This message, if it was actually sent, is one of the more extraordinary communications in the history of the ancient world. A general informing the ruler who sent him to stop a revolt that he has, instead, decided to lead it. What was Apries' reaction? The ancient sources record that he was initially disbelieving, that he dismissed the news as too extraordinary to take seriously. This reaction, whatever its historical accuracy, fits the pattern of the prideful ruler who had told himself that no man could remove him from his throne. It is possible that Apries genuinely had difficulty assimilating what had happened. It is also possible that the disbelief was tactical, a performance of confidence designed to prevent the news from spreading panic through his court and his loyal forces before he could organize a response. What he did in the aftermath was mobilize his Greek mercenaries and the loyal Egyptian forces that remained to him. He had resources. He was not immediately destroyed. The subsequent confrontation with Amasis's force took place at Memphis, a site in the delta that the ancient sources identify but whose specific location has been debated by Egyptologists, in a battle that the ancient sources describe as decisive in Amasis's favor. The battle's outcome was the product of the specific military dynamics that the Cyrene disaster had created. Apries had his Greek mercenaries, professional, capable, loyal in the way that professional soldiers are loyal to whoever pays them. Amasis had the native Egyptian forces burning with the specific emotional intensity that combined military humiliation with political accusation. The numerical advantage and the emotional intensity of the native Egyptian soldiers apparently overcame the professional quality of the Greek mercenary component. Apries' force was defeated. The specific account of what happened to Apries after his defeat is, as noted in the previous section, recorded differently in different ancient sources. Herodotus says he was strangled. Other versions say he was handed to the Egyptian people. What all versions agree on is the end. He was dead, and his reign was over. Amasis, characteristically, gave him a proper burial at Sais in the royal tombs, an act that the preceding account of Amasis in this series described as a statement about the dignity of the royal institution, even in the context of violent transition. It was also, of course, a politically intelligent act. A new ruler who buries his predecessor respectfully signals that he understands the symbolic continuity of the pharaonic institution and does not intend to use the transition as an occasion for institutional desecration. Chapter 2. The heir to Necho. The specific way in which Apries came to power deserves attention, because the inheritance he received shaped the ambitions that eventually led to his fall. Apries was the son of Psamtik II, who was himself the son of Necho II. This means that Apries was Necho's grandson, the inheritor of the memory and the institutional legacy of the most aggressively internationally engaged pharaoh of the entire Sidon dynasty. Necho had launched the circumnavigation of Africa, begun the Suez Canal, built the first Egyptian Mediterranean war fleet, and fought the Babylonians at Carchemish with an ambition that had reached as far as the Euphrates River before being decisively checked. Growing up in the Site court as Necho's grandson, Apries would have absorbed the specific culture of international ambition that Necho's legacy represented. He would have heard the stories of the Carchemish campaign, the Levantine interventions, the naval innovations. He would have understood himself as the heir of a dynasty that had always been outward-looking, that had always defined its greatness, partly in terms of its projection of power and influence beyond the Nile Valley. His father, Psamtik II, had been, by contrast, a ruler of more modest international ambitions. The most important military action of his reign was the Nubian campaign, directed south rather than north or east, suppressing the Kushite threat rather than projecting Egyptian power outward. Psamtik II had understood that the specific military capabilities of the Site state were better suited to defensive consolidation than to expansive projection, and he had governed accordingly. Apries absorbed his grandfather's ambitions more thoroughly than his father's caution. This is not unusual in the histories of ruling families. The more dramatic and more heroic ancestor tends to exercise more gravitational pull on the imagination of a young ruler than the more cautious and more successful one. Necho was the ancestor worth emulating. The fact that Necho had been defeated at Carchemish and had lost the Levantine campaigns was, from the perspective of a grandson 3 generations removed, less vivid than the extraordinary scope of what Necho had attempted. The specific evidences for this inheritance of Necho's ambitions is visible in the character of Apries' own foreign policy. The Levantine interventions, the Cyrene campaign, the specific pattern of attempting to project Egyptian power across the eastern Mediterranean in multiple directions simultaneously. These were all characteristic of the Necho template, the template of a pharaoh who believed that Egypt's historical engagement with the wider Mediterranean world was both a right and a strategic necessity, and who was willing to deploy military force in service of that engagement. The difference between Necho and Apries was the difference between a ruler who was operating in the post-Assyrian power vacuum, when Egyptian projection was filling a genuine strategic opening, and a ruler who was operating in the post-Babylonian consolidation, when the strategic environment had shifted in ways that made the same template significantly more dangerous. Necho had had a window of opportunity. Apries was operating after that window had largely closed. Chapter 3. The Herodotian portrait. Herodotus's account of Apries is the most extensive surviving ancient source for his reign, and the specific character of the Herodotian portrait deserves careful attention, both for what it tells us and for the specific ways in which it shapes, and potentially distorts, our understanding of the man. Herodotus was writing approximately 150 years after Apries' death, in the context of a tradition that had been shaped by the subsequent Site dynasty's history, and particularly by the long and celebrated reign of Amasis. The specific narrative framework within which Herodotus places Apries is the narrative of the ruler, whose pride and overconfidence produce a fall, a narrative framework that fits one of Herodotus's most characteristic storytelling patterns, and that is therefore not necessarily the most historically accurate description of what actually happened. The specific story that Herodotus tells most vividly about Apries is the story of Phanes of Halicarnassus, a Greek mercenary officer in Egyptian service who defected to the Persian king Cambyses before the Persian conquest of Egypt. The story of Phanes belongs, strictly speaking, to the reign of Amasis rather than to Apries, but Herodotus introduces it in the context of his discussion of the Greek mercenary presence in Egypt in a way that illuminates the specific character of the Greek military connection during the Site period as a whole. Phanes was a Greek mercenary who had served Egypt loyally and then chose to defect because the ancient sources give different explanations. He was disenchanted with the pharaoh's court, or he was caught in some political intrigue, or he simply calculated that the Persian advance was the winning side and chose to be on it. The specific circumstances are less important than what the story reveals. That the Greek mercenary connection, which was the Site dynasty's primary military resource, was also a source of strategic vulnerability. The Greek mercenaries were loyal in the way that professional soldiers are loyal to whoever paid them and treated them well, and for as long as those conditions were maintained. When the conditions changed, their loyalty changed. Phanes eventually led Cambyses' army into Egypt, using his knowledge of the desert routes and the Egyptian defensive positions to guide the Persian advance. He was, in this specific role, the living embodiment of the Site dynasty's deepest strategic vulnerability. The mercenary force that was its military strength was also the force that could most dangerously turn against it if the political conditions shifted. Apries' reliance on Greek mercenaries, visible in the specific bodyguard detail that ancient sources record, was the expression of a genuine military logic. The Greek mercenaries were professionally capable in ways that native Egyptian forces were not, in the specific context of the complex military operations that the Site period's foreign policy required. But the reliance was also a source of institutional tension, because the visible favoritism toward foreign soldiers created the specific grievance that the Cyrene disaster eventually ignited. The Herodotian portrait of Apries is vivid and specific enough to be taken seriously as a genuine reflection of a historical tradition, while being selective enough in its emphasis to require critical reading. Herodotus's Apries is a man defined by his downfall, a man whose entire reign is organized, in Herodotus's narrative, as the preparation for the specific catastrophe of the Cyrene disaster and its aftermath. This is the retrospective organizing principle of a historian writing about a man who fell, rather than the prospective experience of the man himself navigating a complex political reality. Reading Apries against the grain of the Herodotian narrative, looking for the ruler rather than the cautionary tale, produces a more sympathetic and a more accurate portrait than the one that the Herodotian emphasis on his downfall provides. Chapter 4. The Babylonian Connection. Among the least examined, but most potentially significant aspects of Apries' foreign policy is his relationship with Babylon. The Babylonian Empire under Nebuchadnezzar II was simultaneously the most important threat to Egyptian commercial and diplomatic interests in the Levant, and a potential diplomatic partner, a relationship governed by the specific calculation that direct military confrontation with Babylonian power was not in Egypt's interest, but that maintaining Egyptian influence in the Levantine states that Babylon was progressively absorbing was. The specific character of Egyptian-Babylonian relations during Apries' reign is imperfectly documented. The Babylonian Chronicle, which provides the most systematic ancient evidence for Babylonian military activities of the period, has gaps that correspond to some of the most important years of Apries' reign. The surviving Egyptian administrative evidence does not systematically record the diplomatic dimension of the Site state's foreign policy. What can be reconstructed from the fragmentary evidence available is a pattern of Egyptian-Babylonian tension that was managed for most of Apries' reign through a combination of diplomatic contact and the maintenance of Egyptian distance from direct military confrontation with Babylonian power. The specific Egyptian intervention during the siege of Jerusalem, the event described in Jeremiah and the Babylonian Chronicle, was the closest Apries came to a direct military confrontation with Nebuchadnezzar's forces, and it was, as the sources record, not a confrontation that Egypt was prepared to sustain. The Egyptian advance that caused the Babylonians to temporarily lift the siege was followed by an Egyptian withdrawal, presumably because the specific military capacity that Apries could deploy in the Levant in 588 BC was not adequate to the challenge of directly confronting the Babylonian army. This was a realistic assessment. The Babylonian military of Nebuchadnezzar's period was, by the evidence of its successive conquests, one of the most formidable land force in the ancient world. Egypt's military capacity under the Site formula, professional Greek mercenaries plus native Egyptian infantry, was adequate for many of the specific military challenges of the 6th century BC Mediterranean, but it was not adequate for a sustained land campaign against the Babylonian army at the height of its power. Apries understood this. His intervention was not an attempt to directly defeat Babylonian forces, but an attempt to demonstrate Egyptian power and provide enough military support to sustain Judean resistance. The attempt failed, but the strategic logic behind it was not irrational. Supporting Judean resistance against Babylon was, from an Egyptian perspective, a way of maintaining a buffer state between Egyptian territory and direct Babylonian control of the Levantine coast. A Judah that could sustain resistance, even with Egyptian support that was insufficient to guarantee its survival, was preferable to a Judah that collapsed quickly and left Babylonian power at the direct borders of Egyptian influence. The strategic logic failed because the specific conditions were not adequate to support it. Judean resistance was not sustainable against the Babylonian advance, with or without Egyptian support. The attempt to sustain it was therefore not strategically irrational, but was militarily inadequate. And the inadequacy, the specific failure of Egyptian military capability to match Egyptian strategic ambitions in the Levant, was one of the underlying threads that ran through the entire pattern of overextension that eventually produced the Cyrene disaster. Chapter 5. The monument record, the physical remains of Apries' reign, the temples he built, the statues he commissioned, the inscriptions he left at the major sacred sites of Egypt, provide a different kind of evidence from the literary sources. Not narrative, but material, not the stories that people told about him, but the physical objects that his administration produced, and that the accidents of preservation have allowed to survive. The material evidence for Apries' reign is thinner than that for his predecessors and his successor. This thinness is itself informative. A pharaoh who builds extensively at the major sacred sites is a pharaoh investing in the institutional foundations of his domestic legitimacy, cultivating the priestly establishment, demonstrating pharaonic piety, maintaining the specific form of royal priestly accommodation that this series has repeatedly identified as the most important institutional mechanism of Site political stability. A pharaoh who builds less extensively, or who concentrates his resources on military and diplomatic activities rather than on temple construction, is a pharaoh who may be making a rational calculation about where his resources are most needed, but who is, in making that calculation, accepting a reduced investment in the specific domestic institutions that the long-term stability of his throne depended on. Apries built a palace at Memphis, the site of his capital and the traditional seat of the northern administrative apparatus of the Egyptian state. The palace's remains have been partially identified in the archaeological record of Memphis, though the specific character and extent of the structure are not fully clear from what has survived. He also left inscriptions at several major temple sites, including Karnak, asserting his place in the royal succession and recording specific ritual activities. But the systematic, large-scale building program that characterized the reigns of the most domestically engaged of the Sete pharaohs, the program that left the most extensive monumental evidence and that most directly expressed the priestly royal accommodation through the physical investment of royal resources in the temple establishments. This program was not the defining feature of Apries' material legacy in the way that it was for Psamtik I, for Amasis, and eventually for the 30th dynasty pharaohs. The building thinness is consistent with the picture of a pharaoh whose primary attention was directed outward rather than inward. It is also consistent with the charge that would eventually be made against him. The charge that his priorities were aligned with the Greek world and the Greek mercenary community rather than with the native Egyptian institutional tradition that the dynasty's legitimacy most fundamentally depended on. The material evidence neither proves nor disproves this charge, but it is consistent with it, and the consistency is worth noting as one more thread in the accumulated pattern that the Cyrene disaster eventually ignited. Chapter 6. The aftermath and the legacy. After the Battle of Memphis and the death of Apries, Amasis spent some effort on what might be called the management of his predecessor's memory. The proper burial at Sais has already been noted. Amasis also made specific statements, through specific ritual acts and administrative decisions, about his relationship to Apries' legacy, neither denouncing his predecessor wholesale nor simply continuing his predecessor's policies without acknowledgement of the transition. The specific ways in which Amasis departed from Apries' policies are, in retrospect, the clearest evidence for what the specific failures of Apries' reign had been. Amasis rebalanced the relationship between the Greek mercenary component and the native Egyptian military by concentrating the mercenaries at Naucratis, the Greek trading city in the Delta, rather than distributing them across the country in ways that made their influence more immediately visible to the native population. He cultivated more deliberately the relationship with the Egyptian priestly establishments, investing more extensively in temple instruction and priestly privileges. He managed the relationship with the Greek commercial world through the specific Naucratis framework, rather than through the more diffuse and less controlled relationships that Apries had maintained. Each of these Amasian policy departures is a diagnosis of an Aprian failure. The concentration of the mercenaries addresses the specific institutional tension between the Greek and native military components. The temple investment addresses the specific domestic institutional neglect that Apries' outward focus had produced. The Naucratis framework addresses the specific management problem of the Greek commercial presence that Apries had allowed to remain in a less controlled configuration. Amasis learned from Apries. He learned specifically from the specific ways in which Apries had failed, and in learning from those specific failures, he built the 44-year reign that this series has already described, the most commercially and culturally brilliant period of the Sete dynasty, built in part on the specific lessons of the catastrophically ended reign that preceded it. This is the specific legacy of Apries, the teaching of the negative example, the pattern of mistakes that an attentive successor could read and correct, the specific institutional vulnerabilities that the Cyrene disaster had exposed, which Amasis had 44 years to address. Not the legacy that any ruler would choose, but a genuine legacy nonetheless. Chapter 7. The Greek world that defeated him. The specific character of Cyrene, the Greek colonial city that defeated the Egyptian army, deserves its own examination, because the defeat was not simply a military event, but a demonstration of the specific ways in which the Greek colonial world of the early 6th century BC was becoming a qualitatively different military force from what the Sete dynasty's strategic calculations had been built to manage. Cyrene had been founded approximately 630 BC by Greek colonists from the island of Thera, in a process documented in ancient sources with unusual detail. The Theran oracle at Delphi had repeatedly instructed the Theran community to found a colony in Libya. The Therans, comfortable in their island home and not particularly eager to disrupt their established lives, had repeatedly found reasons to ignore the instruction. Eventually, after several years of social disruption that the Therians attributed to divine punishment for their neglect of the oracle's instruction, a colony was actually sent. The colony, once established, had prospered with the specific combination of Mediterranean commercial intelligence, Greek civic organization, and the agricultural productivity of the Libyan hinterland that would have been familiar to the colonists from their Aegean background. Cyrene developed a distinctive civic culture, a productive agricultural economy based on the export of silphium, a plant prized in the ancient Mediterranean world for its medical and culinary properties, and a military capability that was, by the early 6th century BC, genuinely formidable. The Greek colonial city that defeated Apries' army was not a minor outpost of Greek expansion tentatively occupying the edge of an alien territory. It was a prosperous, well-organized, militarily capable Greek city with more than half a century of colonial experience, a functioning civic culture, and the specific military tradition of the Greek polis, the citizen soldier trained in phalanx warfare, fighting with the specific intensity of men defending their own homes and their own community. Egyptian soldiers, even professional native Egyptian soldiers, with genuine military experience. Fighting Greek soldiers in phalanx formation, on terrain that the Greeks knew and the Egyptians did not, against opponents who were defending their own city and their own community with the specific emotional intensity that engenders, were not in a favorable military position. The specific tactical and motivational advantages were with Cyrene. The defeat was the product of those specific advantages operating in the specific context of the battle. Understanding why Cyrene won is important for understanding why the defeat had the political impact it did. The soldiers who came home had not been defeated by a superior force in any generic sense. They had been defeated by Greek soldiers, the same kind of soldiers who were the professional core of their own army, the same kind of soldiers who were the pharaoh's most trusted military resource. The specific humiliation was the specific irony. Native Egyptian soldiers, dispatched to fight Greek colonists, defeated by the kind of soldiers that their own pharaoh valued more than them. The humiliation was exquisite in its specificity, and the specific accusation that Apries had sent them to fight the Greek colonists precisely because he trusted them less than the Greek mercenaries drew its persuasive force from the precise character of the humiliation. They had been beaten by the kind of soldiers that their pharaoh preferred to them. The accusation made the defeat into a statement about their own institutional value. That statement was the political explosive. The Cyrene defeat provided the detonator. The long-accumulated institutional tension between the Greek mercenary component and the native Egyptian component of the Sete military was the explosive itself, and when the detonation occurred, it destroyed the reign of Apries and transformed the institutional balance of the dynasty for the following 4 decades. The Greek world that defeated Apries was not the Greek world of the Aegean city-states, the Athens and Sparta and Corinth, that most people associate with ancient Greece. It was the Greek colonial world of the Mediterranean frontier, the world of Cyrene and the other colonies that had been taking Greek culture and Greek military organization to the edges of the known world since the 8th century BC. It was a world that the Sete dynasty had been cultivating and relying on and managing for 3 generations, and it was a world that, in the specific conditions of the Cyrene campaign, proved capable of defeating the pharaoh's own army and triggering the internal crisis that the Sete formula had always been structurally vulnerable to producing. The pharaoh who lost to the Greeks lost to the world he had most trusted. That is the deepest irony of Apries' reign. Chapter 8. The Royal Court and its Character. The specific character of Apries' court, the people who surrounded him, the specific cultural and diplomatic atmosphere that his reign produced, the way the Sete formula's characteristic cosmopolitanism expressed itself in his personal circle, is accessible through the ancient sources in fragments that, assembled carefully, produce a picture of a genuinely sophisticated political environment. The Greek bodyguard is the most frequently cited specific detail. Ancient sources record that Apries maintained a personal guard of Greek and Carian soldiers, the same ethnic composition as the major mercenary contingents in the Seti army, as his closest personal protection. This detail, innocuous in itself, was the kind of visible symbolic statement that accumulated meaning over years of reign. A pharaoh who surrounded himself with Greek soldiers for personal protection was making a statement, whether he intended it as a statement or not, about where his trust resided and what his implicit hierarchy of reliability looked like. In the context of a state whose native Egyptian military component was already developing the specific grievances that the Cyrene disaster would eventually trigger, the specific visibility of the Greek personal guard mattered. It was a daily reminder of the institutional asymmetry that native Egyptian soldiers experienced as a structural injustice. The diplomatic and commercial cosmopolitanism of Apries' court went beyond the military bodyguard. The Seti dynasty had always maintained extensive connections with the Greek commercial world. Naucratis was functioning, the mercenary communities were present, Greek merchants were regular visitors to the delta ports. Under Apries, these connections continued and may have intensified. The specific evidence for diplomatic contacts between Apries and the major Greek powers of his period, the Lydian kingdom under Croesus, the emerging Greek city-states, the Greek colonial communities of the Mediterranean, is fragmentary but consistent with a court that was genuinely engaged with the wider Greek world in multiple dimensions simultaneously. This engagement was not simply strategic calculation. It reflected the specific cultural character of the Site period at its most cosmopolitan, a period in which Egyptian royal culture was genuinely open to Greek influences, in which the court was a place where Greek and Egyptian traditions met and mixed in ways that produced something genuinely hybrid. The archaizing cultural program that characterized the Site period's official artistic and religious expression coexisted with a court culture that was, in its personal and diplomatic dimensions, genuinely open to the Mediterranean world. Apries inhabited this hybrid court with what the ancient sources suggest was genuine comfort. He was, by the character of his policies and his specific institutional preferences, a ruler who was more at home in the Mediterranean-facing, Greek-engaged dimension of the Site formula than in the specifically Egyptian institutional dimension. This comfort is visible in his policies. The Levantine interventions, the Cyrene campaign, the Greek bodyguard, the relative thinness of the domestic temple construction program. He was a pharaoh who looked outward. The looking outward was not simply personal preference. The external world genuinely demanded attention during his reign. The Babylonian advance, the Cyrene situation, the Levantine complications. But the specific degree to which the looking outward was accompanied by a looking away from the internal institutional maintenance that the dynasty's legitimacy depended on is a question that the full evidence of his reign raises and cannot fully answer. What it can say is this: the specific combination of external engagement and internal institutional thinness that characterizes the evidence of his reign is a pattern that the subsequent crisis rendered politically explosive. Chapter 9. The Jeremiah evidence. The Hebrew prophetic literature provides a different kind of window into Apries' reign than any other ancient source. A window through the specific perspective of a Judean prophet whose primary concern was the theological meaning of the specific events he was witnessing, but who was also a genuinely acute observer of the political realities of his world. Jeremiah chapter 44 describes an encounter between the prophet and the Egyptian Jewish community. The Judean refugees who had fled to Egypt after the fall of Jerusalem against Jeremiah's specific prophetic advice. The encounter occurred in one of the Egyptian cities, possibly Tahpanhes in the Delta, the same site that the previous account of Necho II in this series identified as the location of Egyptian mercenary garrisons. In what the text presents as a confrontation between Jeremiah's theology and the specific religious practices that the refugees were maintaining in their Egyptian exile. The scene Jeremiah describes: a community of Judean refugees in Egypt, in one of the Delta cities, continuing traditional religious practices that the prophet considered violations of the covenant, provides a window into the specific character of the Egyptian social landscape of the early 6th century BC. Egypt under Apries was, by this evidence, a place where significant communities of refugees and emigrants from the Levantine crisis were settling, a place where the specific consequences of the Babylonian advance were arriving in human form on Egyptian soil. The refugee communities that settled in Egypt during the late Site period were not simply passive humanitarian problems for the Egyptian state to manage. They were political actors, bringing with them the specific grievances and the specific alliances and the specific cultural identities of the Levantine crises from which they had fled. Managing their integration into the Egyptian social landscape, managing the specific interactions between the Judean refugees, the existing Egyptian Jewish communities, the Greek mercenary communities, the native Egyptian population, and the pharaonic administrative apparatus, was one of the specific domestic challenges of Apries' reign that the external-focused ancient sources do not adequately document. The Jeremiah evidence suggests that the management was imperfect and contested. The specific theological disputes that Jeremiah was having with the Egyptian Jewish community reflect the broader social and religious complexity of a delta that was, in the early 6th century BC, simultaneously Egyptian, Greek, and Levantine in ways that the Sate dynasty's founding formula had not been designed to manage at this level of complexity. Chapter 10. The specific moment of destruction, the Battle of Memphis, is the historical event that ended the reign of Apries, and it deserves specific examination, both for what the ancient sources say about it and for what those sources do not say. Herodotus describes the battle in brief terms that emphasize the decisive character of Amasis' victory and the scale of Apries' defeat. The forces of Amasis, the native Egyptian army that had marched from Cyrene, carrying its specific combination of military humiliation and political accusation, faced the forces of Apries, which were primarily composed of the Greek and Carian mercenaries, whose loyalty to Apries was professional rather than ideological. The outcome was determined, in the account Herodotus provides, by the specific character of the two forces. Amasis' force had the motivational advantage of men fighting for something they understood as justice, for the specific redress of the specific grievance that the Cyrene disaster had crystallized. Apries' force had the professional quality advantage of trained Greek mercenaries fighting for pay. The ancient sources suggest that the motivational advantage was decisive, that the Greek mercenaries, however professionally capable, were defeated by an opponent whose emotional commitment to the fight exceeded their professional effectiveness. Whether this account is accurate in its specific military characterization is uncertain. Ancient historiography consistently overstates the role of motivation and underemphasizes the role of logistics, tactical advantage, and pure military skill in determining the outcomes of battles. What is plausible is that the specific force composition of the two sides, Amasis' numerically larger but professionally inferior native Egyptian force against Apries' smaller but professionally superior Greek mercenary force, produced a battle whose outcome was not predetermined by either side's specific military characteristics, but was genuinely contested and was resolved, in the specific conditions of the Delta battlefield, by factors that the surviving sources do not fully document. What the sources do document is the aftermath. Apries defeated, Amasis victorious, the transfer of the throne accomplished through military confrontation rather than dynastic transmission, and the specific treatment of the defeated pharaoh, captured, housed, eventually killed in circumstances that the sources dispute, demonstrating that the transition, however managed through the specific institutional forms of the pharaonic tradition, was not a peaceful one. The grief of this ending is specific, not the abstract grief of a civilization losing a ruler, but the specific grief of a man who had spent 19 years governing one of the most sophisticated states in the ancient world, who had attempted things that his predecessors had not attempted, who had genuinely believed, or genuinely acted as if he believed, that his position was secure and his power was adequate to the ambitions he had built for himself, and who was wrong in the most final and most complete way that a ruler can be wrong. He was wrong not because he was incompetent. He was wrong because the specific combination of structural vulnerabilities and specific external circumstances had assembled across the full 19 years of his reign into the precise configuration that the Cyrene disaster triggered. He had been operating close to the edge for a long time. The edge moved, he fell. The pharaoh who lost to the Greeks lost his throne, his kingdom, and eventually his life. He did not lose his historical significance. That significance, the specific lessons his reign teaches about the structural vulnerabilities of the Site formula, about the specific institutional tensions of the hybrid state, about the specific ways in which outward-looking ambition can leave internal foundations unattended, is what this account has been working to establish. The establishment is now complete. The following sections draw the implications and close the account. Chapter 11. The Archaeological Trace. What the archaeological record of Apries' reign preserves is, as suggested earlier, thinner than the records of the most domestically engaged of the Sate pharaohs. But what it does preserve is worth examining for what it reveals about the specific character of his reign. The palace site at Memphis, the most significant surviving physical trace of Apries' domestic building program, was excavated in the 19th century by W.M. Flinders Petrie, who identified the site and recovered enough material to establish its general character. The palace was, by Petrie's assessment, a substantial royal complex. Not a minor administrative building, but a genuine royal residence of appropriate scale for a major ancient kingdom's administrative capital. Its specific architectural features, the scale of the construction, the specific materials used, the evidence of decorated surfaces, were consistent with a royal court that was genuinely investing in the physical expression of pharaonic authority. The palace at Memphis tells a different story from the temple construction record. It tells the story of a pharaoh who was investing in the physical infrastructure of royal administration, in the buildings where he actually governed, rather than in the religious monuments that expressed his theological obligations to the priestly tradition. This is itself a statement about priorities. The administrative infrastructure versus the institutional religious infrastructure of the pharaonic tradition. Both were necessary. The specific balance between them reflected the specific character of the governing intelligence that each pharaoh brought to the task. Petrie's excavation at Memphis in the 1880s produced the most important physical evidence for the site administrative center that the archaeological record of the late period currently provides. He found not only the palace site but extensive evidence of the administrative and economic activities that surrounded it. The storehouses, the workshop areas, the evidence of commercial activity and institutional management that characterized a functioning administrative capital. The city of Memphis under Apries was, by this evidence, a genuinely functioning administrative center of considerable scale and sophistication. The state was not neglecting its domestic infrastructure. It was building and maintaining the physical apparatus of governance. The specific direction of that governance, the external ambitions, the Levantine interventions, the Cyrene campaign, does not mean that the domestic apparatus was neglected. It means that the domestic apparatus was functioning well enough to sustain the external ambitions, until the external ambitions produced a crisis that the domestic apparatus could not contain. The archaeological evidence in this reading tells the same structural story that the literary evidence tells. A well-functioning state, with genuine institutional competence, that was operating close to the edge of what its specific internal balance could support, and that discovered the edge in the specific conditions of the Cyrene disaster and the army revolt that followed. The physical buildings at Memphis endured. The pharaoh who built them did not. The stones are more durable than kings. The Site palace that Apries built was partially destroyed in the Persian conquest that followed the Site dynasty's end. The stones were reused. The memory of the palace remained in the archaeological record that Petrie eventually recovered. The memory of the pharaoh remained in the specific accounts that Herodotus and the Hebrew prophets preserved, and that this account has been working to contextualize and enrich. The contextualization is now complete. The implications and the closing follow. Chapter 12. What Amasis remembered. The specific account that Amasis's court gave of his predecessor is in many ways the most important piece of evidence for how Apries was understood by the people who had known him and had been shaped by his reign. Amasis governed Egypt for 44 years after Apries' death, and the institutional and diplomatic choices that characterized his reign were, as argued throughout this account, in significant part the specific corrections to the specific failures that Apries' reign had demonstrated. The treatment of Apries' memory under Amasis was neither hagiographic nor denunciatory. Amasis gave his predecessor a proper burial at the royal tombs of sires, a dignified treatment that acknowledged the institutional continuity of the pharaonic tradition, even in the context of violent transition. He did not systematically defame Apries in official inscriptions or administrative records. He did not attempt to erase the previous reign from the official memory, in the way that some ancient rulers had treated predecessors they wanted to delegitimize. What he did was govern differently. The differences, as examined in the earlier account of Amasis in this series, were specific and deliberate. The concentration of mercenaries at Naucratis, the enhanced temple construction program, the specific diplomatic engagement with the Greek world through the formal Naucratis framework, rather than through the more diffuse relationships that Apries had maintained, the specific personal style of a ruler who understood himself as governing a hybrid state, and who was deliberately and intelligently managing the specific tensions that the hybrid had always carried. Amasis remembered Apries as the lesson. The lesson was not that engagement with the Greek world was wrong. Amasis engaged more intensively with the Greek commercial world than any previous Sate pharaoh, and his reign was the most commercially brilliant of the dynasty. The lesson was that the engagement needed to be managed differently, that the specific institutional tensions it created needed to be actively addressed rather than allowed to accumulate. Addressing them actively, across 44 years, was Amasis's specific contribution to the Sate dynasty's history, and the specific form of that active addressing was shaped, in its particulars, by the specific failures of the reign that preceded it. Apries was the negative example that taught Amasis what not to do. The pharaoh who lost to the Greeks was the teacher of the pharaoh who never lost at all. That is, in its way, a significant legacy. Slow down. Look at the full picture that this account has been assembling. A pharaoh who inherited the most favorable strategic position in the history of his dynasty, who ruled for 19 years with genuine competence and genuine ambition, who intervened in Judea, in Phoenicia, in Libya, attempting to maintain Egyptian influence across the eastern Mediterranean world in the face of the Babylonian advance that was restructuring the Near East, who maintained a cosmopolitan court, cultivated Greek commercial relationships, relied on Greek professional soldiers as the core of his military force, who was overthrown not by a foreign enemy but by his own army, carrying a specific charge about institutional betrayal that the specific character of his reign had provided enough genuine material to make credible. The deeper truth of Apries' story is not the story of a bad ruler who got what he deserved. It is the story of a specific structural vulnerability becoming visible at a specific moment of institutional stress, a vulnerability that had been present in the Sate dynasty's hybrid formula from its founding, but that the specific character of Apries' reign, in the specific conditions of the early 6th century BC Mediterranean, brought to a crisis point that 19 years of competent governance could not prevent. The structural vulnerability was the specific tension between the two populations that the Sate formula depended on. The Greek and Carian mercenary component, which provided military professionalism, the native Egyptian component, which provided numbers, institutional legitimacy, and the specific connection to the 3,000-year tradition that was the pharaoh's deepest source of authority. These two components were both necessary. They were not naturally in equilibrium. They required active, continuous management to maintain the specific balance on which the dynasty's stability depended. When the management was good, as it was under Psamtik I and under Amasis, the balance was maintained and the dynasty functioned with extraordinary effectiveness. When the management was less attentive, when the specific signals that the native Egyptian component was accumulating institutional grievance were either not perceived or not acted on, the balance drifted toward the specific instability that the Cyrene disaster eventually triggered. Apries' management was not bad. it was insufficient, at the specific moment when it needed to be most adequate. The moment when the Cyrene disaster had created the specific emotional and political conditions for the accumulated institutional tension to explode. The insufficiency was not simply a personal failure. It was the product of a specific kind of institutional blindness that is common in rulers who have been governing successfully for a sustained period. The blindness that comes from having managed a complex institutional balance well enough, for long enough, that the accumulating tensions beneath the surface become invisible against the background of apparent stability. The stability was real, the tensions were also real, and Apries, for most of his 19 years, was seeing the stability and not adequately attending to the tensions. Let that sink in. He was not ignoring the tensions, he was managing them. But the management was at a level of attentiveness that was adequate for stability and inadequate for crisis. And the crisis, when it came, was one that the inadequate management could not contain. This is the deeper truth. Not a lesson about hubris, not a lesson about the dangers of relying on foreign soldiers, not a lesson about the limits of Egyptian military power. The deeper truth is a lesson about institutional balance, about the specific work of maintaining the accommodation between different populations that a hybrid state depends on, and about the specific consequences when that maintenance falls below the level that the state's structural tensions require. The Sidon dynasty was a genuinely extraordinary institutional achievement. It had maintained the specific balance between Greek military expertise and native Egyptian institutional legitimacy for more than 3 generations before it failed under Apries. That achievement deserves recognition on its own terms. And the failure of the fourth ruler does not retroactively diminish the achievement of the 3 who preceded him and the one who followed. But the failure also deserves its honest accounting. And the honest accounting produces a picture of a ruler who was, by most available measures, more capable and more intelligent than the simple narrative of his overthrow suggests, but who was operating in conditions where capability and intelligence were not sufficient to compensate for the specific structural vulnerability that the Cyrene disaster exposed. The deeper truth is also about the specific character of the Greek colonial world that produced the Cyrene that defeated him. The Greek colonies of the Mediterranean frontier were not simply outposts of Greek culture at the edge of the known world. They were dynamic, aggressive, militarily capable communities that were, by the early 6th century BC, competing with the major established powers of the ancient Mediterranean world on terms that those powers had not fully anticipated. The specific way in which Cyrene defeated the Egyptian army is a specific instance of a broader pattern that was transforming the military geography of the Mediterranean in the 6th century BC. The Greek colonial cities, trained in phalanx warfare, motivated by the specific intensity of men defending their own communities, were proving capable of defeating armies that were larger, better resourced, and institutionally more sophisticated than themselves. This pattern would eventually produce the Persian Wars, the extraordinary defeats of the Persian Empire by the Greek city-states that are the most famous episodes of this period in the popular memory. But Cyrene's defeat of Apries' army was an earlier instance of the same broader dynamic. Apries was not simply a pharaoh who miscalculated the military capabilities of a Libyan frontier city. He was a pharaoh who encountered, in the specific form of Cyrene's military resistance, a new kind of military force that the Sidon dynasty's strategic calculations had not been fully built to manage. The phalanx of motivated citizen soldiers defending their own city proved more effective than the ancient sources, and than Apries himself had anticipated. This is not science fiction. This is the specific historical dynamic that was reshaping the military geography of the Mediterranean world in the early 6th century BC, and that Apries encountered at the specific moment when his own army was most politically vulnerable to the shock of defeat. The deeper truth about the pharaoh who lost to the Greeks is therefore not simply about the Sidon dynasty's internal tensions or Apries' personal failures. It is also about the specific historical moment, the moment when the Greek colonial world was proving its military capacity against the established ancient powers in ways that those powers had not fully anticipated and could not yet fully understand. Egypt would encounter this dynamic again, more definitively, in the 4th century BC, first from the Macedonian power that the Greek world was producing under Philip II and Alexander, and then in the Persian reconquest that led eventually to Alexander's arrival and the founding of the Ptolemaic dynasty. The specific military transformation of the Mediterranean world that Cyrene embodied in 570 BC was the beginning of a transformation that would eventually end not just Apries' reign but the entire native Egyptian pharaonic tradition. Let that sink in. The specific defeat at Cyrene, the specific shock that overthrew a single pharaoh and ended a single reign, was an early expression of the same broader military and political transformation that would eventually end 3,000 years of native Egyptian sovereignty. Apries encountered it first in its colonial form. His successors encountered it again in its imperial form. The Saïte dynasty absorbed the first encounter. The native pharaonic tradition could not absorb the imperial form. The pharaoh who lost to the Greeks was the first native Egyptian ruler to lose to the specifically Greek military revolution that would eventually transform the ancient world. That distinction, the first encounter with a force that would eventually prove irresistible, gives his reign a significance that the simple narrative of his overthrow does not adequately convey. He was not defeated by a contingent accident. He was defeated by history, not by the inevitable march of some teleological force, but by the specific combination of internal structural vulnerabilities and external structural transformation that his specific historical moment produced. The defeat was not written in advance. It was produced by specific conditions, but those conditions were deeply rooted in structural realities that no individual ruler, however capable, could have fully managed away. This is the deepest truth, and it deserves the recognition that this account has been working to provide. There is one final dimension of the deeper truth that this section must address, and it connects the story of Apries most directly to the arc of this entire series. This series has traced the story of Egyptian civilization from Psamtik I's patient restoration of sovereignty through the Ptolemaic synthesis represented by Ptolemy II and the Rosetta Stone's crisis under Ptolemy V. Throughout this arc, the same pattern has recurred. The institutional wisdom of the Egyptian priestly and administrative tradition sustaining the civilization through specific political crises and specific political failures, providing the depth and the resilience that individual rulers, however capable or however incapable, could not provide from their personal resources alone. Apries' reign fits this pattern in a specific way. His personal failure was real. His institutional inheritance was also real. And the institution, the Saïte dynasty's accumulated formula of pharaonic legitimacy and Mediterranean commercial engagement, survived his specific failure through the specific mechanism of the Amasis succession, which corrected the specific imbalances that his reign had produced and restored the institutional equilibrium that the Cyrene disaster had shattered. The institution survived Apries. The institution always survived. That is the deeper truth that the entire series has been building toward. Individuals fall, institutions persist, and sometimes, not always, not inevitably, but sometimes, the specific failure of a specific individual produces the specific conditions within which the institution rebuilds itself more effectively than it had been before. Amasis was the more effective rebuild. Apries was the failure that made the rebuild necessary. Both are essential parts of the story. The pharaoh who lost to the Greeks made possible the pharaoh who never lost. That is the legacy of Apries, and it is not nothing. There is a grief in the story of Apries that is different in character from the grief in the stories of the native Egyptian pharaohs described elsewhere in this series. The grief of Necho II, the last native Egyptian pharaoh riding south from Memphis while his temples stood complete behind him, was the grief of an ending, the specific, irreversible loss of the 3,000-year political tradition of native pharaonic sovereignty. The grief of Apries is different. It is the grief of a failure that did not need to be permanent, that was the product of specific correctable errors, that was corrected by his successor, and that therefore represents not an ending but a specific, costly interruption in the functioning of a still viable institutional tradition. Amasis rebuilt what Apries had damaged. The dynasty continued. The institutional tradition continued. The cost was one reign, one set of failures, one army revolt, and one ruler's life. By the scale of the catastrophes that the ancient world regularly produced, this was a relatively contained failure. The state survived. The dynasty survived. The institutional tradition survived. Only the specific pharaoh and the specific institutional balance he had failed to maintain did not survive. But the grief is still real. The specific grief of a ruler who had spent 19 years building something, who had attempted things that no previous Site pharaoh had attempted with the same combination of ambition and competence, who had looked outward at the most complex and most rapidly changing strategic environment the Seti dynasty had yet faced, and who discovered, in the specific moment of the Cyrene disaster, that the complexity he had been managing externally was matched by a complexity he had been failing to manage internally. The internal complexity was the native Greek institutional tension that the Cyrene defeat ignited, and the ignition, when it came, revealed that the specific management Apries had provided was not adequate to the specific stress the situation required. The grief is the gap between what was attempted and what was achieved. The ambition was genuine. The achievement was real for 15 years. The failure was specific and it was terminal. And the distance between the genuine ambition and the specific terminal failure is exactly the size of the grief. This kind of grief, the grief of ambition and capability meeting structural limits, is one of the most instructive forms of historical sorrow because it produces the specific kind of lesson that neither the grief of helpless inadequacy nor the grief of pure catastrophe can generate. The ruler who failed, despite genuine capability, teaches something different from the ruler who failed because he was simply inadequate to the challenges of his position. Apries teaches something about the specific structural vulnerabilities of hybrid institutional arrangements, something about the specific conditions under which the most capable governance is not enough to prevent a crisis that the institutional inheritance has always been structurally prepared to produce. This is a lesson worth learning from the ancient world. The hybrid state, the state that depends on the management of two genuinely different populations with genuinely different institutional identities and genuinely different relationships to the central authority, is always under a specific kind of stress that purely homogeneous states do not face. Managing that stress requires the specific kind of active attention to the internal institutional balance that Psamtik I provided in the founding generation, and that Amasis would provide in the succeeding generation. In the generation between them, the attention was not quite adequate. The structural stress accumulated. The Cyrene disaster triggered its explosive release. That is the lesson. That is the grief. And both deserve their full accounting, which this section has now provided. The grief also has a philosophical dimension that this section's reflection requires. The ancient world understood hubris, the specific overconfidence that invites divine correction, as one of the defining patterns of human failure. The accounts that attribute hubris to Apries, the specific pride that said no god or man could remove him from his throne, are almost certainly more literary than historical. But the pattern they describe is real in a non-theological sense. The specific psychological dynamic that the hubris concept captures, the reduced sensitivity to risk that prolonged success tends to produce, is a genuine human tendency, and it is a tendency that is particularly dangerous in rulers because the specific conditions of powerful leadership tend to amplify it rather than correct it. People with authority hear less honest feedback. The institutional feedback mechanisms that might alert a ruler to specific accumulating risks tend to be muted by the specific dynamics of power, by the reluctance of subordinates to deliver bad news, by the tendency of court culture to present the ruler's decisions in the most favorable possible light, by the specific ways in which a ruler who has been managing a complex situation successfully tends to discount evidence that the management is becoming inadequate. Apries does not need to have been uniquely prideful or uniquely blind to be a specific instance of this general human tendency. He needs only to have been a reasonably successful ruler who had been governing reasonably successfully for long enough that the accumulating structural tensions beneath the surface had become invisible against the background noise of apparent stability. The military disaster at Cyrene made them visible again, with catastrophic force. The accountability for that visibility, the specific recognition that the tensions had been accumulating and that the management had been inadequate, is what the story of Apries but provides to the historical record of the Sidon dynasty. He was the specific pharaoh under whom the accumulated tensions became visible. He was therefore the specific pharaoh who paid the price for the visibility. And the visibility itself, the specific exposure of the structural vulnerabilities that the dynasty had always carried, was the condition that allowed Amasis to address them. The grief is the price of the lesson. The lesson is the value of the grief. And the pharaoh who lost to the Greeks paid both. The grief of his specific failure and the value of the lesson it provided to the dynasty that survived him. The comparison between Apries and his successors, between his specific pattern of institutional management and the pattern of his more successful predecessors and successor, is worth sustaining a moment longer because the comparison produces the specific lesson most clearly. Psamtik I built the hybrid from scratch. He understood every joint in the structure because he had designed the structure himself. He knew where the stresses were because he had placed them there deliberately, with an understanding of what balance they required. He managed the Greek mercenary relationship, the native Egyptian institutional relationship, and the broader commercial and diplomatic connections of the Sate formula simultaneously, with the specific wisdom of a founder who was building something new rather than inheriting something established. Amasis inherited the hybrid in its most stressed form, after the specific failures of Apries had exposed the structural vulnerabilities, and rebuilt it with the intelligence of a man who had watched the specific failures closely enough to understand their specific character. He was not simply a more capable version of Apries. He was a specifically corrective version, a ruler whose specific institutional choices were shaped by a specific understanding of what had gone wrong under his predecessor. Apries, between them, was neither the founder who designed the structure nor the reformer who rebuilt it after its failure. He was the ruler who had to maintain it without having designed it and without yet having experienced its catastrophic failure. He was the maintainer, the specific kind of ruler whose challenge is to keep functioning something that a predecessor built and that a successor will eventually rebuild, while managing the specific accumulated stresses of an inherited institutional arrangement that he did not design and cannot simply redesign. Maintainers have the hardest job of the three. They can neither rely on the specific knowledge of the founder, who knows every joint in the structure, nor on the specific clarity of the rebuilder, who can see the structure's failures after they have occurred. They can only manage with the best available tools the specific stresses that the inherited structure presents in the specific conditions of their specific moment. Apries managed, for 15 years, better than the narrative of his overthrow suggests. And then, in the specific conditions of the Cyrene disaster, the management proved inadequate. This is not a failure of the maintainer. This is the specific challenge of maintenance, and the specific lesson it teaches about the specific difficulty of maintaining hybrid institutional arrangements under stress, without the specific knowledge of the founder and without the specific clarity of the rebuilder, is one of the most practically applicable lessons that the history of the Sate dynasty offers. The pharaoh who lost to the Greeks was the maintainer who found the edge. The edge was always there. He found it at a specific moment and under specific conditions that his predecessors had managed to avoid and his successor would manage to pull back from. The finding of the edge is the tragedy. The specific historical significance of that finding is the meaning of the tragedy. And the story of that meaning, assembled from the fragments of ancient evidence, reconstructed from the imperfect sources, told with the honesty that the subject deserves. is what this account has been. The pharaoh who lost to the Greeks has now been given his full accounting. The account closes with the reflection and the closing sections that the full accounting requires.